Now recording. Great. Getting everything started and admitting participants. Actually, Tony, if you can help me, that would be great, since you know how to do this.
So what do you need?
Just admitting people into.
Oh yeah, I can do that. There are a lot of people already.
We'll get started here in a second, everybody.
Yeah, I think everyone's joining.
Fantastic. Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll be with you in 1 second. And okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's event. My name is James Scott. I am a lead researcher at MIT's Real Estate Innovation Lab. I just want to welcome you all to this event. This is the third part of the summer series, Sustainability in the Built Environment, Paths Towards Healthy Growth in Our Urban Environment. This morning, I will be guiding you through this event, and we have a very exciting and very busy morning ahead. And before we kick off, I'd just like to introduce you to the director of the Real Estate Innovation Lab, Dr. Andrea Chagou. Morning, Andrea.
Good morning, everyone. Well, we've had a fantastic summer seminar series so far. It was kicked off on July 31st with COVID-19 in cities. We heard a lot of impactful research about COVID-19's impact in the urban environment, what we're seeing in terms of dynamic changes to how we live, work, and play in the city. And then we moved on to Real or Surreal, which was a specific focus on how COVID-19 is impacting commercial property prices. We did that on August 13th. That was a fantastic discussion. We learned a lot about how we can and cannot observe pricing differentials already for COVID-19's impact. And then today we're actually going to talk about what we need to do in the aftermath and in our new normal for sustainability in the built environment. So this is more about paths towards healthy growth in urban environments, and looking at the urban economic or urban planning perspective, transportation and logistics, but also looking at productivity and health and well-being, how we can change our landscapes to be more green and sustainable, and what that can do either for pricing or for productivity or for our overall well-being in cities. So we have a great program today. We're really excited to kick it off. To do that, I'll hand that back over to James so he can start the program.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Andrea. First off, we have Juan Palacios, who's going to talk to us about this morning about his work on moving to productivity, the benefits of healthy building. Each speaker will talk for approximately 20 minutes, and they'll get a little reminder from me when they have about 2 minutes to go, and then we'll open it up for discussion for about 10 minutes afterwards. And just one quick reminder to everybody, if we could all just remember to keep our stations or our microphones on mute during the course of the presentations, it'd be really fantastic. So I will hand it over to you, Juan.
Thank you, James. Let me see what I can share my screen. Yeah. Can everybody see my screen, James?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Much more.
Thank you. Thank you, James, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizer for inviting me. I'm very excited to start the day and to start the day with the health aspect of sustainability. And what we are going to talk about it today is the impact of the health aspects of real estate on the workforce health and performance. I'm going to use two of my current work. The first one is the work that I've been doing during the summer with CC and CG from the Sustainable Urbanization Lab, and Chris Stelle, one of the alum of the MSRED program. to looking at what we know, what the evidence is at the moment, linking health and mainly indoor air quality to the health and performance of workers, seeing how much we know and how much we need to know, and then providing the evidence from an original field study that I carry out with Niels Kronk and Big Eichholz in Maastricht, looking at how to evaluate in the field impacts on investments in health in the built environment on the workforce itself. So when you look at the evidence, you see that over the last 2 decades, we have mounting evidence on how outdoor pollution and outdoor temperatures are affecting human health and human performance, and that has been shown in different studies with different countries, different sectors, and it's quite compelling how that replicates all over in all of the studies. And you also see that economists show that when these environmental hazards are happening, people react by using the built environment. So when the temperatures or the air pollution outdoors is harmful for people, they tend to get indoors and spend even more time indoors than they usually do. That is already quite a lot. On average, 90% of our time is indoors. Probably now with COVID, it's even more. So they tend to just put a wall in between them and these hazards to protect themselves, or even adapt their built environment to protect themselves even better, their health and their performance. When you see what happens when you cross indoors, you see that more and more there is an attention to how our conditions in the workplace are and how that affects the workforce. And you see that it is raising evidence from these more popular outlets like the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and also the leading real estate players are also more and more putting forward the relevance of health and well-being in the real estate as a core investment driver and business case. What you see with the evidence is mainly coming from studies over the last 2-3 decades in the indoor air community, and is usually coming from control environments where engineers will manipulate the environmental conditions in a lab, and then they will check how the performance of people changes under different levels of CO2 or ventilation rates or other parameters, and see how that will translate, and make some assumptions on how that will translate into some sort of productivity of the general average worker. What we are trying to do here is to understand how easy it is to extrapolate the findings of a lot of this evidence to an actual worker or an actual workforce, to really inform practitioners of what they can expect when they are investing in their own built buildings or their own built environment. What you see is that what we did was going through the PubMed, to the biggest medical literature repository, and extract all of the papers looking at how indoor air quality affect workers' health or workers' performance. And what we found is that the ones that pass the filters are around 40 studies in around 10 countries, so with 6,000 participants all in all. And what we see is that what it is mainly is that a lot of the evidence is based on students, relatively young populations, with a lot of that's from the human side. From the built environment side, what you see is that there are very few studies, almost none, looking at really built environmental conditions and health aspects of real workplaces, real offices, and real spaces where workers are actually there. This is the evidence on where the studies come from, and this is what you see with how does the participants of this study look like, and how they compare to the average office worker in the United States. So what you see is that there is a lot of work in the area of the student population, 20 to 30 years. And when you go beyond that, the evidence is just not there. that has big implications, because one of the things that you learn from environmental science and the medical literature is that these environmental factors, those responses are definitely not constant over the lifetime of an individual. So the way that, for example, PM air pollution affects our brains is by far not the same when you are developing, when you are in this age, as when you are a young adult, and then when you are in the later age of your life, and how when your brain is in the cognitive decline phase, how that affects you much harder than when you are in the early adulthood. So what we can say, or what we know now about how healthy buildings affect us, is mainly coming from very young populations. And when our workforce start becoming older, then extrapolating any findings that we have here, it starts becoming more and more problematic. When you see also from the built environment side, so where are the studies coming from, and what do we know, and how can we extrapolate it to the average office building, we also see that where the evidence comes from is really not what we try to extract the findings to. So a lot of it is lab in universities or classrooms in universities, where they check how people perform in simulated tasks. And in the field studies, even the type of buildings is usually quite different from an average office building that we have in the cities around the world. The type of task where we usually extract try to infer the changes in performance of an individual is also quite different from usual work. Sorry, I have one of these fast furious guys around. Quite different from the normal task that someone will do in an office in a normal day. What you see is that most of it is that simulated cognitive performance test, or some basic job performance doing performance in the form of arithmetic sums and so forth. So it's very difficult to then understand how someone like us will perform better or worse when we are put in a better building or in a healthy building. Also, in terms of the effort that these participants were putting, was also different from what the effort that you would expect from an average office worker, or at least the stakes that they were facing were much different from what we have. So in some of them were fully voluntary. People will not have any consequences to just not even show up. A lot of them, they were just participation stipend. They were just paid to show up, or some wages by staying there for a whole week, but nothing had to do with how well they will perform the task. So it's very different how an office worker is remunerated in the field, where if they don't perform well, or they don't perform well systematically, they will have consequences to their payroll or their employment status. So what I'm going to talk in the second half is trying to really fill this big gap and really try to use a lot of the insights from the lab and see whether they will survive the field. So what we did in this study was really checking a real investment with a real workforce and seeing the impact of this investment in the health aspects of the building on the health of the workforce. We haven't gotten yet the productivity results in. This is fully based on the health, but at least it's already a step of checking how does it survive from the lab to the field in a real work setting. And to do that, we had a collaboration with a municipality in the Netherlands with around 1,400 workers, and we could follow the workforce moving from an old office building to a new office building that was fully designed to maximize the health. So really going from 0 to 100. So even in the field, there were a lot of, you could see that a lot of the real investments will have a way smaller change in the places that they will change the workforce from to. So this one is going to really from 0 to 100. So it's already a big test to see whether you will survive. If you will not survive in this setting, probably you will not survive in a lot of settings. we have a unique opportunity to explore these questions because not the 100% of the workers were moved, but only 70% of them were moved. And we could follow them before and after the two cohorts to have a very nice difference in difference approach to examine how the health of these people were changing over the first years of the new developed healthy building. The way that they decided how individuals were shipped from one place to the other were generally by, the decision was taken at the team level and generally was made based on how much interaction they will have to external clients of the municipality or to the citizens themselves to bring them to the new building. So a lot of the IT people and a lot of the people that are working in the background that don't really need to see people in their daily jobs will not be moved, and most of the people that have daily or weekly interactions with others, they will be moved to the new building to have a better appearance from the municipality side. We have around, we follow their actual sick leave and a lot of the health symptoms and perception through extensive surveys, and we also check at the team level that will match the administrative records. The way that we collected the information about the perception of environmental quality was using the scales developed by the Center for Built Environment at Berkeley, where they have several questions asking people how the different aspects of the environmental conditions of their workplace was perceived by them in terms of how they will help them, how satisfied or how they will hinder, to have like the opposite to check whether there will be consistency. Also, we have a lot of aspects into the aesthetics and furniture and so forth to have it as a placebo test to see whether it is really the environmental conditions or is something else that is changing, that is driving any health effects that we will map. We, as I said, we will follow difference in difference strategy where we have as a core term the difference in difference term. So the people that were relocated after the relocation, how that will show differences in health and in the health of participants and the perceived environmental condition of participants. We also break, because we have 3 surveys after the move, we break this after move period into the three surveys that we have to see the stability of the results. We could follow people individually over the set of the different surveys, so we can have individual fixed effects. We also have survey with fixed effects to account for any major change in the levels of environmental conditions outdoors or any other things that are changing in the whole workforce that is not related to the building. And something that I forgot to say is that the new building is just 500 meters from the old one. So in terms of the type of socioeconomic and environmental conditions of the people, the exposure of people is pretty much the same. Mm. And then we collected a bunch of, as I said, a bunch of questions related to the general characteristics of the building to just show that it is really the aspects that we are measuring and not something else. These are the results into the perception of environmental quality in the work phase. So this is the reference. This is how it changes for the treatment group with respect to the baseline, and this is how it changes for the control group with respect to the baseline. So you see that the control group pretty much stays around where it was, and the treatment group improved by 20 percentage points in their scales, in a scale from 1 to 7. In the temperature, the effects are smaller, but they're there too. And things like noise actually didn't really got better. Light got much better also. When it comes to the health of these people, we focus on the sick building syndrome. So that's also something that is quite common in the environmental literature to show the progress related to the health conditions of a building. That is all of these symptoms that you have when you go to, basically they ask people whether they have certain symptoms when they enter the workplace that disappear as soon as they leave, or several hours after they leave, related to headache, throat ache, dry eyes, and some other things that are connected after years of investigations of the from the environmental science literature on how people are tend to be affected and how the mechanisms work from the unhealthy aspects of a building to the health of conditions. And what you see is that in these health symptoms, we also observe on a 20 percentage points reduction of the prevalence of sick building syndrome in the group that was moved to the new building. So 20 percentage point, 20% less people were showing these symptoms every day when they go to work in the cohort that was moved. So quite significant there. When you see what determines this drop in in health symptoms, you see that they're mainly coming from the drops, the improvements in air quality. So this was the main connection to how the health of these individuals was improved just by keeping everything else constant in their life, but just changing the place where they work. What we see is also that a lot of the evidence that were missing from the lab studies are actually, when you see the age brackets that were missing in the lab studies, are actually the ones that are driving our results. So the people, the elder they got, the more significant were the results. And when it comes to the connection to more closer measures of administrative cost or more closer measures to factors of productivity, we undertook a mediation analysis where we have the health symptoms as mediator for the sick leave. And what you see is that there is no direct impact of the relocation on the sick leave itself, but it all goes through the health symptoms. So that tells you also that in terms of the placebos and so forth, that anything that was not really guided by the health symptoms of people was really not significant. The same for job satisfaction. So when we had scales developed by labor economists on how to measure job satisfaction, and you see again the same pattern that as everything is mediated by the sick building syndrome, by the health symptoms of people, and in both cases we have like 1.2 percentage points, 12 percentage points drop in the prevalence of sick leave, and 73 percentage points drop in a standardized measure of
2 minutes, Juan.
Okay, no problem. Now that's great, James. I'm going to just wrap up. So one of the things, like kind of putting everything together, there is a shortage of field studies now examining the healthy, the effects of healthy buildings on real workforce, even though it is getting more and more attention in practitioners, and it's getting more and more interest by the real estate industry. At this moment, in terms of really estimating the return on investment, we are still missing a lot of the external validity of the findings to how applicable that will be to an average workforce and an average building outdoors. We try to start building that evidence, applying these methods to applying quasi-experimental methods to a real workforce that was moved from one old building to a new building designed to maximize health. And what we observed is around 42% reduction in the prevalence of sick building syndromes, and an increase in the this was with 20, sorry, an increase in the job satisfaction and reduction in sick leave. That's it. Thank you, James.
Juan, thanks so much. That was fantastic. I'll just open this up now for questions to the group. I might just myself start off some of the questions if that's okay. I'm just curious with relation to the new building within the studies. Do you give an outline of what was actually in the building? Was it a ventilation system, or was it a filtration systems, or was it the design of the building? What was actually giving it the better air quality? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so they had a whole design for the ventilation system based in natural ventilation principles. So what they had a very fancy way is that they will suck the air from the top of the building. They will put it all the way down, where they will refresh and ventilate the building with a sort of like with a bunch of plants and so forth, and then they will let the air, just following like natural physics principles, to go back all the way out of the building, circulating from top to the from bottom to the top, using also the differences in temperature. So they had a solar chimney that will basically suck up the air and bring it out. So they had a whole, most of the effort in the environmental conditions were in that building were based on the ventilation system to do it in this way, to use it like as least possible mechanical ventilation, and also to use as much as they could all this oxygenated air from plants and so forth. And also the materials, they were also based on cradle to cradle to try to reduce as much as they could the impact of the building construction. So they had a lot of emphasis on materials and in ventilation itself.
And Juan, I have a question related to James' question. Do you guys measure using sensors the air quality and the noise or the light, or just perception of the participants?
We did both. The thing is that we couldn't link at the individual level this, but we did both in the old and in the new buildings. We did a measurement campaign with the municipality of levels of CO2, relative humidity, temperature, and what you see is that the building managed to hold lower temperatures much better in the new one, and also the levels of CO2 as a proxy for how good is the ventilation were also quite down in the new building. For noise, they were actually, what we didn't measure noise per se, but because it went from a closed office settings to an open space setting, then a lot of people actually complain because of the noise, because the privacy and the type of noise that you will have in the background were actually worse. And if you see also the scales, there was no change. It was not significant. If I would expect, like the municipality itself, before seeing the results, they would expect that they would go worse, because the number of people complaining about how noisy it was in the workplace was worse. So we did a little bit of both. Thank you, Adriana.
I have one more question. So if we have time. So on that slides about the determinants of the health improvements, how did you guys get that? I didn't get the point. I don't know if you didn't mention or I didn't get the point, but how did you isolate the determinants on the model?
So we basically collected a bunch of aspects of the building at the workplace, and we basically just checked before and after, like kind of checking the deviation for everybody of their health parameters, the sick leave and the sick building syndrome, and correlate that to how the changes in all of the environmental scales and the aspects of the building change for them. So just seeing this deviation, checking how it correlates the changes in the health with the changes in their perceived conditions in the workplace, seeing what correlates.
Yeah, more. But how did you guys isolate the fact of pollution, noise? Did you include like a fixed effect on that? Yeah. I didn't get.
Yeah, okay. In all of them we have, yeah, exactly. So all of them we have fixed effect, and it's just basically seeing what, it's more like a horse rate, seeing what correlates more with the benefits in health that we observed.
On there, okay.
Yeah, right. So it's still like kind of, it's of course not causal at all. It's just basically like seeing what is, given that you can observe like individual changes, what correlates the most to see what would be the most likely driver of these health benefits.
Okay, got it.
Thank you.
If any of the other participants have a question, I'd love for you to ask it. If you don't, then I will jump in. But I would defer to all of you and give you, the guests, of course, first choice. I can't talk to Juan in person anymore, but I can always ping him on WhatsApp. So please go ahead and ask. Otherwise, I have one burning question.
I have a quick question. If the symptoms are down so dramatically, it doesn't seem like the results were as dramatic, 1% and 2% versus 40 some odd percent. Were you surprised at the gap between the two?
Well, I was, indeed, I was, it is quite of a difference between the two. The thing is that a lot of these people that were working there for quite a while, if they will take the sick building, if they will go on sick leave every time that they will feel sick, I think that they will have been off the company for quite a while. I think that they were just kind of, it was a kind of this systematic, this chronic pain that they were getting used to just by going to the office, and they were just accepting that that was the normal thing. When they went to the new one, they were actually probably the more biological thing were kicking in, and that was one of when they were less often forced to take the sick leave. So I think that there are a few things, like, because the sick building syndrome is a quite broader concept. Like, you also have things like headaches and so forth. So things that a lot of us have gone to the office with and work without taking sick leave, but still part of it is also correlated with actual things that will get you in bed and not going to work. So there is always a mismatch, like when you see also in general health economic studies, when you see like health symptoms to health, demand for healthcare or others, there's always a big gap between the two, because there are some things that I can feel bad, but I might be going on with my life. But there are some things that make me feel bad and also make me stay home. And these things are not 100% set. But it is true that there is a big difference between the two.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, we have time for just one quick more question if anyone has one. Andrea, you want to ask your one?
I've planted mine with the discussant, so I have an inside track. So I've planted that question there on how we can help our community of institutional and corporate owners adopt strategies like this. But let's move on to Adriana. Juan, that was fantastic. I really loved that.
Thank you.
Great job, Juan. Next up, we have Adriano Costa, who's going to talk to us about his work on road transit and the denseness of Sao Paulo's urban development. So I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Juan, for the presentation. Thank you, Andrea, for the invitation. So today I will present, can you guys see it's in the presentation mode? Yeah, so now better. So now I will present a paper that I'm developing with Chris Igras and Sichi on avenues, rail transit, and denseness of São Paulo's urban development. I'm part of the Sustainable Urbanization Lab. I'm a postdoc researcher there, and it has been great working with a great team in the lab. So, okay. So this is a paper that we offer a causal inference on how investments in road transportation infrastructure and rail transit impact the vertical and horizontal urban development in the city of São Paulo. So we are talking here about road transportation, I mean urban road transportation, avenues and arterial roads, and rail transit, so I mean subway and metropolitan rail system in the city of São Paulo, and the impacts on vertical urban development, so I mean houses occupying areas that were previously not urbanized, and horizontal urban development, so I mean tall buildings, more than 3-floor buildings in the city of São Paulo. And we found that the construction of avenues crossing the urbanized area to connect suburban and peripheral neighborhoods generated urban expansion. And we also found that the investments in rail transit promoted vertical neighborhoods with a higher building density. So we took advantage of some idiosyncrasies of São Paulo's transportation development that offered us the opportunity to use the urban river courses in the city and abandon streetcar lines as an instrument for road and transit network expansion in the city. So this paper brings 3 innovations. We develop an innovative historical instrumental variable using the river courses and abandoned streetcar lines. We differentiate the impact of urban roads and rail transit. So I don't mean here highways or regional rail transportation, railways. I mean, really avenues, arterial roads, and subways, and kind of subway transit. And we differentiate vertical and horizontal urban development. So these are three main innovative aspects of our paper. And we are contributing with the literature about the interaction between transportation and land use. This is a body of knowledge, important body of knowledge in the transportation and urban planning field. And the Bounds-Nose paper on the North American and Chinese context are the most closely related analysis to ours, as it is also applied intra-city perspective. So transportation and urban studies are have been explored in different academic papers, mostly in an intercity perspective. So how transit is important, how transportation is important for city growth and for regional development. But in intra-city perspectives, there's a good literature on these, empirical literature, but not that much empirical papers. Even though we have good evidence on highways promoting suburbanization in the North American context and also other contexts. But this paper is the first to investigate how urban road transportation and rail transit construction differently contribute in a joint verification to the horizontal and vertical urban expansion with causal inference. So our framework is based on the idea of denseness and different kinds of transportation. So we know that mass transit require more density and more ridership demand to justify the high investments and to pay the high operational costs of a transit system. But on the other hand, transit accessibility also promote more concentrated and intense accessibility around stations that decreases very quickly with the distance as it does not reach the last mile. So this left side hand graph here, we can see like a new station promotes high accessibility around the stations, but it decreases very fast. And the road accessibility offer more dispersed and less intense gains in terms of accessibility, not limited to the bordering area of the access points of the highway or the road, as it does not have this last mile problem. So the accessibility provided by roads is more dispersed and less intense than railways. And this has important implications in terms of urban economics and real estate development. So it will affect differently real estate prices and will also generate different incentives for building development around these stations or access points to highways. But when we talk about transportation and urban development, we always have to deal with a lot of endogeneity related to this relationship about transportation and urban development. So we can have transportation infrastructure being built in very urbanized area or in areas that are still not, there's not that much people living around there, but transportation requires some kind of population, and population also requires some kind of transportation. So there is a lot of endogeneity on this relationship for transit and also for roads. And we can think about three possibilities, three possible hypotheses on how this relationship goes. So we can have a reactive transportation hypothesis with transportation following people, being built in areas that are already urbanized. Or we can have like a leading transportation hypothesis with transportation coming first than people. Or we can have like an ordinance hypothesis. So people coming, transportation coming to areas that are some people living there, but also the transportation will bring more people to that area. So this is the complex endogeneity around this transportation and land use investigations. To give you some very brief background about transportation development in São Paulo, we had our first trolley system open in the beginning of the last century, and it was and the system was closed in the mid 60s, in the beginning of the 60s actually, but the system started to be abandoned and not really an important transportation mode in the city after the 30s. So from the beginning of the last century into the 30s, it has increased a lot in terms of lines, in terms of cars running, and in terms of ridership. And then the system started to be substituted by the bus system. And the bus system was expanded dramatically from the 30s into the 60s, and still recently, today we have more than 15,000 buses running in the city of São Paulo. And the subway was built in São Paulo only in the 70s. In the beginning of the 70s, we have the first subway line open the city, and more recently we have some BRTs and bus corridors investments. And one thing that we found is that some of these subway lines were built in areas, in avenues, in areas that previously we had a trolley line running there. So this is an example, Jabaquara Avenue in São Paulo. It has today a subway line running underground here, but it was also an important trolley line in the beginning of the 20s. So we saw that there's an overlap between the subway lines and the trolley lines, with a significant gap in time between these two systems. So in each of these subway lines, we had like we don't have a trolley system running there in like 30 to 20 years gap. Shifting to the avenues and arterial roads development in São Paulo, there is also an interesting story behind it. In the end of the 20s, it was proposed what we call the Plano de Avenidas in the city of São Paulo. That is the plan of avenues. Basically, the city was growing so fast and was spreading out to a huge area in the city, and they proposed a plan to open avenues and arterial roads in the system, a radial system to connect to pre-existing avenues and roads. So it was proposed in the 20s. It started to be developed in the 30s, and a lot of these avenues were opened from the 30s into the 60s and 70s. So it was a huge plan, very important plan for the first systematic transportation plan in the city of São Paulo. And one of the most important strategies to find spaces to build these avenues was taking the course of the free space left by rivers in the city. So these are two examples here of avenues that were built over rivers. So they canalized the rivers and they built avenues on that areas. This was Saracura River in the city of São Paulo. It's very nearby Paulista Avenue. Who has been in São Paulo before know that this is the most important area in the city. And this is Saracura Avenue in the beginning of last century, the Saracura River, sorry. And over this river, they started to build the 9 de Julho Avenue. That is an extremely important avenue in the city today. So they built the avenue over the course of the river, and the river was canalized underground. And today that we have an important avenue there, that sometimes these rivers emerge. When we have rainfalls, the river emerge and show up, and we remember that they were there one day. So not really sustainable way to develop avenues, but it gave us an important source of exogenous variation to use an instrumental variable approach to recover the causality of avenues on the built environment of São Paulo. So the validity of our identification strategy rely on two sources of exogenous variation for transportation variables. One is that the several avenues of the city of São Paulo were built taking advantage of the free course left by rivers, and the subway lines use the path of old abandoned street line cars. And we don't have clear reason to suppose that the presence of rivers or abandoned tramways in a region would directly influence the urban development that area. So this is like the basic of rationale behind any instrumental variable approach. So we developed here an instrumental variable approach for these two pairs, rivers and avenues, and abandoned streetcar lines, and the subsequent development of the subway system. We used, for urban development, we measured the horizontal development of the city using the urban footprint of selected years from the digital cartography of old maps and remote sensing analysis. And the vertical development of the city, we took information from the São Paulo's land use tax database that has the construction data of each existing building in the city. We filter only the more than 3 floors building to get this sense of verticalization of the city. So this is the kind of urban development data that we have. And we worked with 4 main variables. In the urban development, we have the urban area coverage and the number of buildings aggregated in 2 kilometer cells. And the transportation development, we have the road network length and the transit network length in each cell in each period. And we then applied the instrumental variable approach. I will show here the results of the long difference regressions. We first tried the first stage regressions with the rivers, predicting the development of avenues, the variation of avenues from the 1929 until 1997. 1929 is when the plan of the avenues plan was proposed, and when we started to see the decline of the trolley system. And we see here that the first stage performed pretty well, with rivers predicting avenues really well. The first stage regression, changing the transportation network instead, using the transportation network instead of avenues, report no significant coefficient. And the regression of the changes in avenues network length in each cell between this period also has a highly positive coefficient. So at the end, we have like investments in urban roads as a good predictor for urban expansion of the city of São Paulo, but rivers not related to change in the urbanized area. What do we expect for a good instrumental variable approach? The first stage regression using the trolley lines and transit also performed pretty well. So trolley lines, old trolley lines, as it was in 1929, predicted pretty well the development of transit in that cells. And the same first stage regression using avenues network instead of transit reported no significant coefficient, and also trolleys predicting number of buildings directly is not correlated. So both instruments and looking for in the first stage seems to be valid. And then we tested that. This is the 2SLS regression results with avenues with the river courses as an instrumental variable, and we are interested here on the impact of avenues on the urban rate. We also include we also control for the number of buildings, the distance to the CBD of each of the cells, zoning limits. We systematize zoning limits, historical zoning limits in São Paulo's urban development. And we also included natural restrictions as dams or like environmental reserves in areas that could not be urbanized. And we also control for the baseline urban rate. And we found that the positive and significant results of avenues on urban rates on these 2SLS regressions just with one instrument. And in the weak instrument test and the Hausmann test, it passed pretty well, confirming that the instrumental variable approach was a good choice. Here for transit, the 2SLS regression, now considering the streetcar routes as an instrumental variable, also performed pretty well with investments in transit predicting the number of buildings with positive impact and significant impact, including all the controls, and also in the weak instrument test and the Houseman test, it passed pretty well. And then we included both instruments in both regressions. So here we have river courses and the old street line routes in the two regressions, and then we here include the avenues investments, the investments in avenues, road investments, and investments in transit to predict urban rate. And we see here very consistent results with around 5% increase in the urbanization rate of each cell for each kilometer of new avenues built between 1929 until 1997, and no results of transit on urban rate. However, when we go for the number of buildings, we see here the inverse, with transit impacting the development of buildings and no impact of avenues on buildings. And here we have around 1,300 new buildings for each additional kilometer of transit on that cell. This is around 130% increase. I will show later.
2 minutes, Adriano.
Okay. And then we were able to also separate commercial and residential buildings. So our results show that transit impacted the development of building development in the city of São Paulo, and then we separated in residential development and commercial building development. This is not about horizontal development, only about vertical development. And we found that residential building development reacts less to transit than commercial building development. The parameters here are significantly higher for commercial compared to residential, but they are all significant and positive impact. We also performed the weakness instrument test and the Houseman test also performed well for when we include both instruments in the both regressions. So our conclusions is that each kilometer of new avenues and arterial roads in the city of São Paulo increased in 5% the local urbanization rate between 1928 and 1997. And each additional kilometer of rail transit line was responsible for an increase of 130% in the number of buildings in that region, with commercial real estate reacting more intensely to investments in transit than residential real estate market. This is the first joint causal inference on urban roads and transit different impacts on urban and vertical urban development. And our results, has significant implications for the literature on transportation and land use, but it also strengthens pro-transit arguments that not only promote sustainable mobility, the relationship between development of transit and more sustainable travel behavior is pretty clear, and we have a lot of evidence about that. But we also have here important evidence that pro-transit policies would also contribute for sustainable urbanization with a more vertical and dense neighborhoods. What is pretty intuitive and pretty anecdotal, but with very few empirical evidence supporting these. So our results has implications also for this new urbanism and contemporary urban planning that uses transit development as a strategy. That's all. Thank you.
Fantastic, Adriano. Thank you so much. I will open it up to the group for questions. If anyone would like to jump in, Dennis, I think has one. You're on mute, Dennis.
Dennis, you're muted.
I thought this was how about that? I thought this was a really, really interesting presentation, but I have a question about Sao Paulo. If the transit helps to concentrate people in a small area in higher density, then one thing which always confused me a little bit about Sao Paulo is that the focus of the transit system is on the historic downtown. Yet in the past number of years, companies and people have been abandoning the historic downtown, which is a gorgeous collection of Art Deco and 1930s architecture with a beautiful environment, very humane. And I just wonder what the role of transit is in retaining such a place, and why isn't the transit system bringing people into that area of the city? Juan, do you have any ideas?
Thank you, Dennis, for your question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. So the downtown of São Paulo has lost population. It's to concentrate a lot of jobs, and a lot of people say that the downtown of São Paulo has moved and is moving. And when we actually have a development of a financial district, like around 3 kilometers or up to 5 kilometers far away from the historical downtown. I presented evidences on development of buildings. Unfortunately, we don't have information about population density on this granularity. So it's very difficult to understand how much transit would be able to bring back people to the downtown of São Paulo. However, we see some recent movements of people getting back to the downtown of São Paulo. So, and transit is being developed to other areas of this of the city, more in the not really peripheral, even though we have today some important lines reaching out the peripheral areas of the city. So it's I don't see from my results that this specific movement of transit getting back people to the historical downtown. So, but what we see is that transit is being able to promote more dense neighborhoods in areas that were previously like underdeveloped areas. So it would be fantastic to have the opportunity to verify this hypothesis on like based on data. But for today, what I have is an anecdotal and personal observation and some information that people is getting back to downtown of São Paulo. What is a good news for the city then is because it's in fact this downtown of São Paulo has a huge and gorgeous set of buildings, Art Deco buildings, and it's a fantastic environment.
Yeah.
So yes, can I add one point on this question? Yeah. Yes, so I feel like the last part of our analysis is we can just distinguish between commercial and residential. That might be a very another like promising direction to go, and we can do more. So from the spatial equilibrium of the internal city structure, I mean this very fast transit, real transit, will lead to the concentration of commercial land use, but a dispersion of residential land use. So basically jobs will be more concentrated in the center, but the residential people can now go to the suburban place to live, but still won't lose the convenience to travel to the center for work. So I think, I'm not sure. So yes, so later we can discuss how we can do this heterogeneous analysis to see this real transit impact in the intercity, the central area and suburban area. See whether it has different results. That's something we can later explore.
Yeah, sure.
The jobs and the housing, the different impacts of the real transit on that in the central area and the peripheral area.
So that's
It's 10 o'clock.
that's really interesting, Sichi. So they're performing, affecting the land use in two ways: pulling out people from living there, and pulling in companies that provide jobs. I think to be able to measure that is a really interesting contribution.
Yes, yes. For example, I did observe using Beijing data this phenomena when the new subway lines were built, and more office buildings just popped up in the central area because the line connects the city center and the suburban place. But new residential development just pop up in the suburban area because now people can just so easily go into the city center. So they just go to suburban places.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
We have this test.
Very cool.
I think we have, Ariana, do you have a question? Hand raised.
Yes, yeah, I have a couple of clarification questions. Thank you, Adriano, for the presentation. So the first one was, if you can give us a rationale of why using the grid cell approach versus the administrative traditional unit, and then how did you sort of decide the size of the cells? So that's one question. And the other one that I had was, why is the number of buildings sort of the best variable to look at vertical growth? Thanks.
Yeah, good question, Ariana. Thank you. So the definition of the unit of analysis, the spatial unit of analysis, we were as we were working with points and polygons information, we were free to decide the size and the format of this unit. So there is no reason to use the administrative units because they were so big, and we didn't want to really be limited by this administrative. It would not bring us any additional information or any additional data to be limited to these administrative units. And we did some sensibility test with the smaller grid cells with 1 kilometer, half kilometer, and 2 kilometers. And what we see is if we control for the neighborhoods effects on this grid cells, what we see is that effect is started to be more important in the neighborhood cells than in the local cell. So we performed some sensibility, and we found out that the 2 kilometers was fitting better to our results. And the other question.
If I understood correctly, you were looking at number of buildings as a proxy for vertical growth, right? And so I'm curious why that measure.
Yeah, so this is another part of the research that we want to develop more. As Sichi mentioned, we want to try to separate the fact on the city center, or like in more the core part of the city and the periphery parts, and trying to see different impacts. Another research effort that we are doing is trying to use, we have the build-up area of this building. So we are trying to use kind of FAR measurement for that, but we don't have the results yet. So for today, what we had to show is this using the number of buildings, but certainly we have areas that has like very tall buildings and others that have like medium-sized buildings. So this is the next step, trying to measure like a FAR measurement for. Yeah,
cool. Thank you.
You got the point. So this is our next step.
Thanks.
One other note. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andrea.
Well, this is just to build off of Ariana's question. Is there any way that you guys can gain access to the 3D geometry of the city? It might be relevant for now, but maybe even 5 years ago or even 10 years ago, using some sort of LiDAR scan, just to see the development and be able to take that geometry as a better predictive measure of growth and density over time?
Yeah, that would be fantastic, Andrea. We have like for São Paulo, they just in the beginning of last month, they put available complete 3D map of the city using LiDAR information. So it's a fantastic source of data. But for recent and for like nowadays, to map the city nowadays, as we are using like historical perspective. We don't have any 3D model before the 2000s. So we can use that to control for variables for nowadays of the city and to develop other things, but not for this specific research.
We just to build off of that, one thing that we did do in the lab just to sort of manage that problem that we had for New York City in our 3D model, that we worked with some RAs in the architecture department who worked on extrusion over time of the 3D model. So if you have some database that allows you to know the buildings and maybe even just some dimensionality of the FAR, the floors, they can work to do some fairly decent extrusion over time. It won't be perfect, but it'll potentially help with that, that geometry problem that Ariane is talking about.
And you can match that with the 3D nowadays, and how much it's matching with the estimation using the building information. We have kind of FAR information because we have the build up area and the number of floors in the building. So we can potentially do that. That would be super interesting. I will ask you for more details about this work you have done. That's super interesting.
I would.
Last question, Dennis.
Okay, I'm sorry. I would be interested in connecting financial data to this process that you're trying to measure of urbanization, because the financial data is much more finely attuned. So let me give you an example of what I mean. We build a boulevard and development happens, but development happens because the value of the land has gone up. Now, in part, that depends on the degree of access the land provides, and also in part it depends upon the design of the boulevard. If it's an elevated highway, actually land values will go down around the boulevard. If it's a beautiful, humanely scaled kind of Parisian boulevard, the land values are like, with a lot of greenery, the land values are likely to go up. So I think it would be really, really, really interesting to look at how these pieces of infrastructure affect the value of the land on either side of them as a step to understanding the urbanization patterns. Does that make sense, Andrea?
Andrea, this basically is your urban vibrancy project. That is. So you can just give Dennis like a half minute overview of that.
Yeah. So what we are trying to do from this research that this is my research agenda on how transportation and this kind of investments impact the built environment. And what we are doing is trying to look on the impact of more recent investments on the attraction of amenities and firms and land values using more recent information. Because here for this paper, we have like an important data constraint that we are doing a historical analysis. So for the financial part, we try to use the financial also as a instrumental variable following other papers, other empirical papers, but it ended up not being successful. So we abandoned this financial part for this analysis. However, for more recent investments, this is super important. So we are trying to explore these with more recent investments and how they impact land values and attraction of amenities and attraction of firms around this urban development areas. So yeah, that's super relevant. Unfortunately, we cannot use on this paper, but certainly it's an important research agenda that we are trying to explore in the lab.
Okay.
Really
thank you. Thanks for the questions.
Thanks, Dennis. Adriana, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And with that, we will take a break for 10 minutes. So we will reconvene here at about 10:20, and we will move on with our next presentation. So see you all then. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are now next going to hear from Annie Thompson and her work on predicting city growth with machine learning. So I will hand it over to you, Annie. Good morning to you.
Hi there. Yes, I've been working on a project with Simon and Dongju and David Murati. Let me share my screen here. And what we're doing is we're doing a study for a developer in China and trying to look at predicting city growth using machine learning. And we're in sort of the earlier phases of this study, which will be concluded next in the spring. So I'm just going to go through these slides. Take a while to load. So we're looking at the background. We want to look at.
And before you get started, could you just try to move it into presentation mode?
Oh, sure.
That's okay.
Okay, is that better or worse?
I do.
I think you need to turn presenter mode off.
Is that it?
It should be in slideshow.
Slideshow,
Use presenter mode. Just untick that on the right. Yeah, untick the use presenter mode.
Ah, there we go. Okay.
Yeah.
So let me go back. Is that any better?
And then you just do from beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Press F5.
All right. So sorry for that little glitch there. So we're doing this research based on a project that we had. Sichi and Simon are working with a developer in China, and the idea is to try to determine what makes a city good for development and what kind of amenities attract development to a city. And so where there's a background, we look at location quotients in terms of what the distribution of employment by industry is within a city, the growing industries, get into the machine learning techniques, which will come along further down the road, and comparing the US to China to try to look at what's worked here essentially and what might work or might be a good indicator of growth in China. So let me go here. Right, things not changing. All right, so there's two stages to what we're doing. There's a two-stage analysis. The first is identifying which Chinese and US cities will end up growing and what is driving this growth, and then look at the link between the cities in both commercial and residential real estate prices. We're pretty much into the first phase of this now, investigating the link between how cities grow, how industries grow, transportation infrastructure, all the different variables or groups of variables that affect city growth. And we're plan to use machine learning a little bit more to predict causality among the city growth. Okay. So it's taking a long, there we go. The first stage is gathering data, okay, figuring out the methodology, which we've pretty much done. We've been having webinars with China and looking at starting the second stage analysis is what we're getting into now, is looking at a little bit more at the US versus China and what impacts growth here versus there, okay? As I said, it will go on until next May, so there's there's a lot more to be doing down the road. All right. First, what we started with is looking at location quotients. So for different cities across the US and China, what industries are the greatest or fastest growing industries in these different metro areas or locations? And then whether this industry growth among these industries impacts national growth, and also the attractiveness or the other data that leads to industry growth, and whether or not certain industries are more important in terms of inducing growth than others. All right. So I'm going to just show a couple of a couple of maps here that show the industries of most growth in China. Okay, we use we took the Chinese data and the US data and tried to kind of converge it using NAICS code, and then applying these location quotients. And you find in China, these are provinces, I believe, in China, the location quotient values, information communication and computer service and software is the fastest growing overall in China. And these are the darker are the most, the highest growth, okay, relative to the China overall. Real estate in China is the second fastest growing industry, and location quotients for real estate are here. So I'm not all that familiar with China or Chinese real estate, so I'm a little more familiar with the US, so I won't get too much into trying to figure that out. And finally, third fastest growing in China is the finance and insurance industries. All right. And what we find, one thing is, you know, in the US, we're looking here at metropolitan statistical areas, which are different than, you know, the geographic definitions in China. So there's also a lot of white space here because there's a lot of areas in the country where there are no metropolitan statistical areas. And the location quotient, the fastest growing industries in the US is really the healthcare and social assistance. It's pretty broad, 2-digit NAICS code. And across the country, you see pockets of real strong growth. Now, let me be clear on this. Is not just hospitals, okay? So it's not necessarily really high income types of jobs. It can be kind of, social assistance is different than surgeon. But in any case, this is kind of the dispersion of the location quotients across geography in the US. And if we look at the second fastest growing is the professional, scientific and technical services. And, you know, you've got the DC area here, you've got the Boston metro area here, pretty typical, you know, fast growing areas, San Francisco, I believe. Anyway, so the idea is to find the fast growing industries, determine whether or not they are, you know, growing industries that will have a big impact on an area, and work from there. All right, so how do we work this all out? Okay, we're looking at both just regular OLS equations, as well as we're going to construct some machine learning algorithms so that we can learn from the data. And there's two types of data that we're talking about here. We have wide data or high dimensional data, where there's many predictors and a relatively small n or number of geographic areas. And tall or long data, where there's many observations but only a few predictors. We kind of have both here. We've got many growth drivers for a relatively small number of cities, I think, in China, but we have, you know, a fair number of MSAs, 384 in the US. So we're applying right now OLS regressions. So, but as I mentioned, the second stage of this is going to be machine learning. And the idea is to use classical lasso regressions. I won't get into the details on that since that's still coming down the road. But working through to see machine learning what the predicted values are depending on all the variables that we have that look like indicators. All right. So to start with, we've got a change on change regressions. We don't really know what the model is, which regressors are important. We have all kinds of regressors to try to figure out what the best model would be. It can be overfitting if we try to use too many regressors. Seems like what my statistics class I was just teaching about regression. So a little more about the regressions. Here we're going to include right now an OLS regression, or to start with, where we eliminate certain variables depending on whether they're significant or not. Okay, and among the variable types in China, we've got transportation infrastructure. So we put all of these into the model essentially and figure out which are the most important. In China, we have the transportation infrastructure variables. One thing to note here is there's very different data availability in China than there is in the US. So although we were easily able to kind of create the industries, some of these other variables we have to do as best we can in terms of what constitutes transportation infrastructure versus industry growth, entrepreneurship, human capital. You know, here you have the share in the US, you have the share of the population that's completed college or more, may not have those same kind of variables in China. Amenities, days of snow, number of hospitals, and then output, so which is GDP, disposable income, government income. So all of these are variables that we kind of thinking about putting into the pie or the pile to kind of do our determination. And Dongzhu ran regressions to find at the 2-year sort of forecasting what parameters were most important or significant, looking 2 years out, 5 years out, and 10 years out. And we can see the positive and the negative coefficients and whether or not they're significant. So there's a lot of variables that may be more significant further out, but aren't necessarily significant early on in studies. There's some that go across all three, like real estate, GDP per capita, and others that that's not the case, okay? So if we're looking at predicting growth 2 years out based on the model that we created here, which includes these factors here, a negative on days of frost, which probably would be expected. We see the expected growth in these different locations, the darker being higher, expected growth, lighter being lower. Much of this either is no data or very, very low growth levels. 5-year data, we see a much higher rate of growth, a little bit more distributed than the 2-year data, but predicted 5-year growth concentrated really around major areas in China. And then looking 10 years out, it's a different pattern. You kind of see this area having much stronger growth than in the 2-year model. Okay, let's see. So the first report we had was looking at information transmission, computer services and software, and finance insurance were the fastest growing in China during the past 15 years. The models have not been run yet for the US. The data is all cleaned up and put together, and now that the stats class is over, I'm going to be running the models for the US. Okay, healthcare and professional, scientific and technical were the 2 fastest growing industries in the US during the past 15 years. A lot of the reason is that some industries that you would have expected to grow quickly, because they grew quickly in China, had already been established here, and so their growth may not be as strong. Okay, And then there's a number of provinces. These are those that are predicted to be the fastest growing cities in China during the next 5 to 10 years. We've got here, okay? So the next step that we're going to do after I run the US models is to use machine learning to try to eliminate those explanatory variables that are less important, kind of have the model eliminate things that aren't needed and come down to what's the best explanatory situation we've got there. So this will be started in the fall. And going back, we have the regression models that we started with, and going out from here to add more of these other variables. Okay, so our estimation methods, what we're using is we're first using OLS, right? So we include all the regressors and minimize the mean square error. Next is the idea of lasso machine learning regressions that minimize the residual sum of squares, and that can be subject to constraints on the size of the coefficients, et cetera. There's Stata has a lasso model that will be the next step. Square root lasso, it's a modification of the regular lasso model, so it minimizes the regression sum of squares, and instead of the minimize the square root of the regression sum of squares instead of the regression sum of stairs overall. And both of these will use relationships between those two. Now that is really all I have here for this presentation. I know I went through it a little bit quickly, but the idea is to just expand more over time. And Dongju, if you have anything that you want to add here, feel free. There's some variables in the US, like I said, that we're still trying to put together, and many of the variables in the US will be different in terms of their predictive value than they are in China. So trying to work with that inconsistency is really going to be important. Not sure how that's going to go thus far. Okay. Questions? Dongju, anything to say?
No, not yet. Thank you. Let's see what other people want to ask.
Annie, I might just jump in with one question quickly. With relation, in respect of certainly with the American forecasting, or the US forecasting, are you taking any sort of incentives into account? And the ones that are coming to mind are obviously, let's say lower tax rates in certain areas, but more importantly, the one that's getting an awful lot of acclaim at the minute is the opportunity zones that have been implemented, through different government initiatives. Are you taking things like that into account?
We have any ideas that people have as far as that is, we'll see if we can look at them. It's just putting too much into the basket we're a little worried about, especially if there's nothing comparable between the two countries. So I don't know if there's anything that comparable to opportunity zones in China.
Well, it would be incentives offered for growth. They may not be called opportunity zones. The question, and very interesting, great, thank you for presenting. The question I had was, it seems that you're assuming an equal absorption rate in each of these metropolitan areas or cities or whatever the units are. In other words, as if these are all vessels into which we can pour a certain number of people based on their presence of certain characteristics. But actually, the cities are different and have different abilities to absorb population based on their geography, their setting, the quality of life, the type of development, and so forth. It's a lot easier to expand Phoenix than it is to expand Boston, or increase the number of people. So will you I know this is a whole nother layer of data, but I've just asked the question how that fits in.
I mean, I think that kind of data would be interesting to add to the pie or whatever you want to call it, because it is very different in Phoenix than it is in Boston, and there's many characteristics of both locations that are similar, that are different from other locations. So there's as we said, there's an idea of still adding data if we can, and determining what data is really valuable or relevant. And I've pulled together a lot of data for the US. And we basically categorize the data into certain pockets or whatever, but that would be something interesting as well to put in there.
Yeah, it's a measure of the facility towards growth, or the ease of growth.
Mm-hmm.
If you have tough geographic situation, you're not going to have, it's going to be more difficult to achieve growth.
Right.
Yeah, I think we can add both the geographic factors and those factors related to the real estate market, such as the supply elasticity or other things that may also reflect the ability to absorb population. If we can have that kind of measures or proxy for the ability of a city to absorb population or workers or jobs, firms, then I think our model will be more robust. But this is a very important layer to predict the growth.
James, I have a question if that's okay. So to build off of this idea of trying to understand the relationship between opportunity zones of what happens here in the US and a little bit of what happens in China, this sort of brings me back to some Sam Tak-Lee research that we did a while ago. And I think that Haijing started to work on in the Sustainable Urbanization Lab, but this was starting to understand the role of arts districts and how they were incentivized by the government to sort of transform and whatnot. Not all of them were, but, and then the other thing that was also really highly incentivized was co-working spaces and innovation districts to some extent. So there was variation in backing. It's not the same sort of mapping or at the same geographic scale, but there is something to that. Certainly the arts districts has more of an opportunity zone sort of feel, because it's sort of taking these older industrial parks and then sort of transforming them into these incredible vibrant communities like 790 in Beijing, which are now super gentrified spaces with massive job growth from global conglomerate. So I think that's
You're
one
looking
area
at more like micro level.
Well, yeah, but it's also at the scale of the opportunity zone. So I think if that's the scale that you're looking at, I leave that up to you guys, because you've become the experts in that, but it just reminds me of that. The second thing that I'm picking up here is because we do so much on wide data in the lab and trying to understand, at what point do we have too many regressors in the model because we're trying to do this more accurate pricing dynamics for commercial or residential or for development. And my experience with the lasso technique and of various kinds when we get to the squared and not is that it actually just keeps confirming the model. And so I think it would be very interesting for this paper in particular to have an appendix that really diagrams and discusses what aspects of the features that you chuck in there that come back and don't really need to come back. I mean, for the New York model, we've thrown up to 300 to 400 and even sometimes 500 different regressants in there. And the lasso comes back and says, fine, you're doing just great. This is a great model, and we've run it and cut it at various different ways. So I'm very curious how your research pushes up against this wide data issue in real estate. Just because we have so many different dynamic features to the built environment that, so I think I'm very curious about what happens there. And so if you can speak more to that, or if you can promise more on that, that would be great.
Like I said, we haven't run through that machine learning piece yet, but that's interesting information to know, Andrea, and we'll keep you informed certainly as we get to that.
Yeah,
vary by region as opposed to by city. So since we do so much at this very micro regional space, and then we drill into like streets and trees and all sorts of different stuff, everything just comes back and is very meaningful. So I'd be very interested in that comparison at a national level or at a global level. It's very, very fascinating.
Yeah, and I want to add one sentence is that I think Lasso does not only help us confirm whether the model is robust or whether the model is meaningful. Well, at least in our study, it is very useful for us to select the very important predictors for the city growth, which is very difficult for us to select by ourselves if we only use the linear regression. We use the OLS or other white data, but for the method that Lasso did this, we cannot know exactly how they selected a specific variable, but I think at least the final result it gets back to us can give us a message of what is the really important predictors of city growth, and that is can give us a very meaningful reference.
Yeah, there's very limited literature on this. We never know the one true model, of course, as a concept. We don't know it, but I think we don't really discuss it like that. And so I think it's really important to make that a relevant conversation, especially for the data science world, because we don't have these conversations around what are the ways that we're actually endeavoring to find the true data generating process. So I think this is incredibly relevant. So building out an appendix that is thoughtful to this would be really great. I know it's not the focus of your work, but being mindful around that or producing a one-pager on that, I think would be really helpful.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we have time for one more question if we have one.
Can I ask something?
Mm-hmm.
So thank you, Annie and Nongshao, for the presentation. I have two comments. So first, in the transportation field, you guys didn't include any regional transportation variable. So I saw that bus system. I don't remember there is one more variable that I don't remember now, but I think that regional transportation plays an important role today in China. I have been learning so much with Dongshao and others in the lab about the impact of high-speed rail in developing certain cities that are now connected to international cities like Shanghai or Beijing, and how it has played an important role. So maybe it's not that relevant today in the US, as in the US we have a regional transportation system well developed, even though we can discuss about investment on this system, but it's developed. And maybe today the high-speed rail expansion has some similarities to what was the interstate highway plan in the US. So I think that's really important to include that in the Chinese context. Yeah. And also I know that in the urban transportation part, the expansion of the subway system might bring also like more productivity for the city. So I think that in the Chinese context, it's also important for the main cities, the cities, the international cities that has really expanded significantly the subway system. But I think that regional transportation plays an important role in China. And I have a question about the growth. How do you measure? Maybe I lost the point, but you said city growth. It's population growth, jobs growth, companies growth. It's like measured by the location coefficient that you showed in the very beginning. And do you guys plan to differentiate different kinds of growth? So growth like high-tech based growth, like Silicon Valley growth, and other like manufacturing based employment growth. How do you guys plan to differentiate? What do you mean by city growth?
Okay, Adriano, first the city growth question. We use the population growth now. At least for the first stage analysis, we only use the population growth. The population growth rate as the city growth measure. But yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. We can use the different levels, different layers of the growth, such as the job growth, even the high-tech firms growth, the number of entrepreneurship growth, something like that, to measure the different aspects of the city growth. And for the regional transportation, we do add the high-speed railway and the flight in the China's city growth analysis. It's just because Annie shows presents the examples of the variables that we use in our model.
Okay.
So that is not the whole list of the variables, but we do include the interregional and the intra-regional transportation. But for the subway system in large cities, we do not have a very good proxy to measure that right now. But yeah, I think we can consider including that into our model. As you said, that's very, very important for like
for the US, it's more like airport access, because there hasn't been much of a change in terms of other forms of accessibility, right? So flights, subway systems around here, certainly high-speed rail is not doing very well here. So that's just one of the variables where there's kind of an apples and oranges that you have to combine.
That's great. Annie and Dong Zhao, thank you so much for that. Was fantastic. That was really, really brilliant. So we are going to move on in the interest of time, and we're going to move on to our next paper, which is from Tony Yang, which is the financial impact of street level greenery on New York commercial real estate. Thanks again, Annie.
Thanks.
Tony, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm gonna start to share the screen. Okay, can you see the screen now?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, awesome.
You can throw it into full screen mode if you want.
I'll do that. Okay, sounds good. Hi everyone, thanks a lot for this opportunity to present. My name is Tony, and this is a research project based on the collaboration between three researchers from the Real Estate Innovation Lab, and also one from University of Wisconsin at Madison, and one from MIT Sensible City Lab. So our research began with the interest in street level greenery. It is one of the most used and widely perceived urban design elements in today's cities. However, due to the difficulty of measuring this element, few research has looked into the economic value of street level greenery. So only in the recent years, the advancement of image recognition technology has enabled the researchers to measure this element, the street level greenery. So currently, the existing literature has identified the importance of urban greenery from different fields. So we can, it helps reduce the urban carbon footprint, increase the thermal comfort. It brings benefits of public health and wellness. It is also a prime indicator of social inequality. Urban variation in access to trees is also a signal of inequality in social outcomes and racism. So to us, the research question is how much does street level greenness, a specific type of urban greenery, affects real estate pricing? So in this research measures street level greenery in Manhattan, New York City, through computing a novel street level green index using images collected from Google Street View, and then we assess its impact on real estate pricing. So the results show that the street level greenery is statistically and economically significant for commercial property prices. Usually dense greenery yields a positive coefficient for commercial real estate transaction prices ranging from 4.7% to 6.3% per square meter. Then these results are also robust to various specifications and robustness checks, including investments by business improvement, sorry for the type of business improvement districts in New York, and also proximity to parks and subway stations, and also different specifications of the green index, which we'll explain later. So in the past, real estate economists and planning researchers generally assess financially green land use, more specifically, let's say parks and green trails, or in some ways they call greenways. So this literature tends to focus on the housing market. Researchers have found that the proximity to green spaces result in an increase in residential property value ranging from 3% to 20%, depending on the specific type of the green space and also the urban context in comparison. So, for example, as we listed, Morancho concluded that basically the distance to parks matters much more than the size of the park. Then every 100-meter distance away would lead to equivalent to approximately around $2,000 drop in the housing value. As for the green trail in Indiana, we see a premium of 2.4 to 14%, depends on the neighborhood. Then in Texas, we see 5% for 5.3 to approximately 20% of the property value. Then only since the 2010s, the emergence of street view images provides a novel data source in categorizing the urban landscape. So integration of street view images at the big data scale and also deep learning image recognition algorithm allow for a new approach to human scale measurement of spatial features in the urban environment, at also for even national scale. So more nascent research has been conducted on the relationship between street level greenness and also housing price using GVI, which, sorry for the abbreviation, it means Green View Index, calculated through street view images. So the results show that visible street greenery and also street accessibility at global scale hold significant positive coefficients for housing price, meaning there is a positive economic impact. While there is some literature studying the effect of the urban greenery on housing price, none of the research up to date has assessed the impact on commercial real estate. So within the commercial markets, we have seen evidence of correlation between green building technology and the pricing. So that means a better understanding of the relationship between the street level greenery would serve as crucial supplement to urban landscape design and also investments in the urban greenery. Now let's talk about the identification strategy we have. So here I'm using just an example, one of the building example I extracted from our database. We look at the coordinate of the building. So for each building coordinate, the algorithm will collect all the Google Street View coordinates within the set buffer zones. So here in the second image here, we have 4 circles. Each circle, it's a 30-meter radius, 50-meter radius, 80-meter radius, and 100-meter radius as the buffer area to collect all the Google Street View coordinates. Then each coordinate would have 4 images to construct that panoramic view. So that's what we would see for example, the 4 images. Then the question becomes, then what is Green View Index exactly? A short answer is it's the average percentage of a green pixel calculated from the collected Google Street View images. So here, this is an example, again, the same address that I just showed before. It's a relatively lower ranking. It ranked at the almost 400 out of all the samples. Then these are some of the images that we collected. Then this is not all the images we collected. It's just a small portion to fit the slide. Compared to this one, this is a much higher ranking green view location with Green View Index. Here we can see there's definitely a stronger presence of street level greenery compared to the one before. Then what does green view index measure exactly? A short answer is it's the visually perceived density of greenery on street level. So there's also, of course, there is one concern. For example, in some cases we might see there's a signage or a building or a car that is green. But because those, and yes, the answer is the algorithm will calculate all the green objects, will take into account all the green objects. But because green signage or green cars are relatively very small portion, so when we have enough data, it won't be really skew the final results. And we set specific criteria to extract the green pixel. So we focus on only the green plantations. Then, and also we would control for the time of the year. So images we have right now include only images taken during April to October in Manhattan. So in this way, the example here shows it captures the green presence, the greenness. So we no longer need to, let's say, calculate the area of, for example, this street corner park. We don't really take try to count how many trees we have on the street, but we just use the Google Street View images. Now let's talk about how we process all the data. So at the very beginning, we have 4 sets of data. But then we notice the 30-meter radius set has quite few samples. So in the end, then we quickly decide to proceed with the other 3. The other 3, when we look at the summary, they have similar mean, but except that the 50-meter radius data has a relatively larger standard deviation. However, we still decide to go with this one, the 50-meter one. The reason was related to the urban planning and also design of Manhattan. So in Manhattan, each urban block is approximately 274 meters by 80 meters. And so if we have a building that's has entrance to only one side of the block instead of the other, the 50-meter radius would capture the Google Street View coordinates at the door front, but not on the back side of the street. And also, if a building has 2 entrances, then the 50-meter radius would actually capture 2 door fronts on both sides of the block. This compares to, for example, an 80-meter or a 100-meter radius. It will capture much more Google Street View images from nearby blocks that we don't consider as immediately impacting on the targeted building. So that's how we decide to go with the 50-meter radius set. Then at the same time, we realized the GVI, the green view index is quite skewed. So we divided into 4 buckets. So very low, quartile 1 would be very low, then quartile 2 low, medium, and high, before we run with the regression model. At the same time, we also add other relevant variables. So here would be the distance to the closest park, and also distance to the closest subway station. Then we took the inverse and to normalize the data. Another very important external factor that we take into account is the business improvement district. In New York, there are there are I think 25 BIDs in total. BIDs is a formal organization made up of property owners and the tenants. BIDs deliver supplemental services such as sanitation, maintenance, public safety, promotion, then capital improvement, and also beautification services for the areas. And then all these are funded by a special assessment paid by property owners and within the same district. So in many ways, they invest, while some BIDs invest generously into the streetscape maintenance and also beautification, some probably deploy their funds and focus on on other areas. But we think that this would affect the greenness on the street level. So when we look at the descriptive statistics, we can see the price, the transacted price by average is increasing along with as the green index increases. So the two higher quartiles have significantly higher price than the lower quartiles. And the third quartile has the highest transacted price. And we suspect it's probably because it's compared to the fourth quartile, it has a closer, in general, closer distance to subway stations, while the fourth quartile are in generally a little bit further away from transportation. For the quartile 1, a lot of samples are actually in BID, but the highest quartile of green index, most samples are not in the BIDs. Then finally, we employ a regression framework to explain the transacted price with a series of variables. So here we estimate a semi-log and linear regression model where we explain the transacted price per square meter for a given building I as cross-section. So XI would be building features, time, location, fixed effects. This would also include BID locations and also submarkets. Then buyer type, seller type, lender type as well. Then the GI is a vector of green view index variable divided into 4 quartiles. So 4 buckets: very low, low, medium, and high. And we set the very low as the base group. The explanatory variable here is the log transacted price per square meter. We observe individual transactions over 2011 to 2018, and this time it overlaps with the time period from which Google Maps took Street View images. Then when we look at the results, so the results of the model explain around 46 to 51% of the transacted price of a building. Results show the log transacted price is explained by location, time, building, and the transaction features. This part is not shown here, but if you guys are interested, please just let me know. I'm more than happy to share the results because the table is way too long. Then after controlling for the full list specifications of the model, we document the building where the green index in the second, which is a low, medium, and high categories yielded positive coefficient. And we tested the different specifications with the column 1 document only the green view index. Column 2, we added distances. Then column 3, we added the design metrics, which is from another paper from the lab. Then we have the 4th and the 5th, which is the BIDs. So in the 5th, sorry, the number is a little bit messed. But so in the here in the 4th column, we have the in BID. So we have only one dummy variable that includes all the BID, that identifies whether the building is in BID or not. In the 5th column, we broke down the BIDs into neighborhoods. So that will be 25 additional variables of BID. So they function similar to the submarkets in the model. Then, which is here, all the BIDs broke down. Then, as a result presented here, when controlling for location, transaction time, and the building features, transaction features, the results of the hedonic analysis suggest that the building surrounded by high quality street level greenness have a premium compared to those without. So here we see the medium and the high GVI have significant and positive coefficients compared to the lowest quartile. Then to help us understand this better, so these are the sample images I extracted relatively randomly from the data set we have. So you can see the 3rd and the 4th quartile, the medium and high GVI, have definitely a stronger presence, especially the fourth one, compared to the one with the within a lower quartile. So to conclude, we measured the street level greenery and its impact on commercial real estate pricing. Our contribution is to measure one of the most seen urban design elements and assess its value in realized buildings. We find that the presence of street level greenery does differentiate price for commercial real estate. A couple of important takeaways, as we have seen from this research, the GVI implies that there's a measurable shift from what we look at traditionally, the greenery through, let's say, land use or the distance, to now with greenness presented in the street view images. Then, as mentioned before, we have the positive and significant results from the GBI. Then, along with this trend, we can expect there's an expanding role that the image recognition would contribute to the measurement of asset value, because the data, the street view images is essentially very cost effective and also readily available online now.
2 minutes, Tony.
Yes, wrapping up soon. And then also this research is first from a commercial real estate standpoint. So it yields practical implications that corporate and institutional investments portfolios in office and real estate are highly correlated with urban planning and the institutional investment in the urban landscape. So real estate developers, in that sense, are incentivized to align with landscape architecture and the urban planning experts to this value enhancing urban amenity, street level greenery. And with that's the end of the presentation and also our research. Thanks again.
Fantastic, Tony. Thank you so much. That was really great. I'll now open it up to the group for any questions.
I have a question.
Yes,
please.
Thank you, Tony, for the presentation.
No
so I'm wondering if you've thought about this green level index capturing just like proxying for well-maintained areas. So for example, it's likely to see these sort of high greenery areas being correlated with better infrastructure in general. So less crime, also more sidewalks, possibly lower densities. And so I'm wondering if you can also sort of include these covariates to see if they are correlated and try to tease out like what exactly is this green, if it's only capturing the greenness or if it's proxying for better maintained areas. So that's one point. And then the second one is, and to this sort of identification thing, I'm wondering if rather than controlling for the BIDs or bids, then you can also look at that as sort of the intervention, right? Look, like use it as a treatment in the sense that you can see if these areas got treated with better maintenance, more greenery, then you can sort of look at it as a discontinuity and try to identify more precisely the effect of better maintained green spaces by comparing like inside and outside. So I'm wondering if you've thought about that.
I mean, great, absolutely great comments. In terms of the first one, let's say better maintained urban environment, I think I can think about one example, which is the crime. So that's actually one of the variables that we haven't taken into account, but it might be intuitively it might be correlated with the result that we want to see. And others, I think, right, as long we should dig into more available data in New York, and then we can incorporate those into the regression. Definitely, I think I can expect they improve it.
Yeah, at least the sidewalks. I think New York has very good data on that. So
yes.
That's one thing that's easy to incorporate just to see.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and also for the BID, that's a great, because BID is what we found. BID is essentially a very interesting thing, because in Manhattan there are so many BIDs, and a lot of our samples actually fall into BIDs, and we suspect if BID are really making an impact on the street maintenance, that actually to some degree distorts our relationship. So it's not, it becomes almost like this endogenous relationship. It's not exactly the green view index increases the price, but actually that higher valued property owners who can contribute more to the funds of the BIDs would lead to a better maintained streets. So that relationship is very interesting. I think the way we can do that is to look into how much they spend specifically on the streetscape maintenance and also beautification. We could do a robustness check on that, but there's a little bit, well, missed opportunity is that the BIDs, they don't release that much data for the past 10 years. All the available data right now is on the spending part, has, I think, only from 2017 to 2019. So that's something, but we can still, with using those years to do a robustness check. But I think that's definitely a good point.
Thanks.
I think also the original sort of robustness check that we did pass on that, Ariana, kind of pointed to that the same sort of result that we did when we controlled for in-bid and not in-bid. But the sample gets really small between 2017 and 2019, but we can add it as an appendix that we thought about it. I think also the idea of the sidewalks is great. I just recently went looking for a new house, and what I discovered was that, you know, neighborhoods that were ultimately on the fringe and didn't have much greenery investment ultimately didn't have sidewalks. So there is this pattern, this ability from an urban design perspective. I mean, Jane Jacobs comes back and lives very prominently in our minds here, that, you know, if I haven't taken care of the sidewalk, then I can't actually plant a tree. And because I can't plant a tree, then I can't get that green density that creates this value. In the New York Times this week, there was a article about Richmond and looking at social inequity across neighborhoods, and essentially ultimately black neighborhoods or brown neighborhoods, and how they actually have an absence of trees in their neighborhood. This also points to actually this systemic problem. And if you go to Treepedia and you look at what your group has done, then you see in those neighborhoods as well in New York City that there's no trees there. So I think this research really points to also, because so much has been done on the residential side, how we could ultimately look at the commercial improvement of communities, and particularly communities of color, and say, wait a second, you have to invest in the sidewalks and the trees, because if you don't, you're just actually leaving them behind. And that is incredibly, especially as we're discussing, defunding the police and where could that money go. One of the big things that I would say is let's definitely put some money into some trees as an outcome.
Yeah, so I have two questions. So the first one is also the identification, as Ariana already mentioned a lot. And I think this kind of hedonic regression always suffer from these omitted variables. And we have some ways to deal with that, as just now, Andrea, you mentioned. And also this, I'm thinking this BID also, maybe you can try some regression discontinuity at the boundary and the inside and outside, and the other things almost similar. But also another way to address this is exactly what you said. We acknowledge we do have this omitted variables issue, but we say that basically that's a reality in the urban setting, and this is a multiplier. Like a multiplier effect, and all those things are bundled together, and disadvantaged neighborhoods, they lack this and that. So we acknowledge that, but we see the greenery is always correlated with other nice amenities, and this we are not going to precisely quantify this like 2.2% like that, but we can use that to argue these are some proxy for nicer neighborhood, but greenery is one important factor, indicator of that. So that's the identification. Oh, another thing I'm thinking is because these are commercial real estate, and I think you have this tenant information. So you can check for these buildings with higher greenery index and lower index, whether they have heterogeneous tenants, because they might have different willingness to pay for the greenery. So that's another way to enrich the story. Like a sorting process, and second thing is I'm wondering, because this is so rich data and machine learning based algorithm, and I'm thinking for the Google Street View is from outside, like from the street to look at the building, But whether really matters for the tenants inside is from inside to outside. When they sit in their office room, when they look out through the window, and whether they can see the green space. So I'm thinking whether you have the data or approach or algorithm, because it's so advanced, to measure from inside to outside as a matter of their really experience from the tenant's point of view, not from the street.
For the great comments, but for the question, I think that's a curiosity that we definitely share. I think a relevant paper from the lab is well, not even Andrea. I'm thinking about Ermark's paper, the
value of views, the value of views.
But Suchi, I think to answer the question more specifically, unless we have a same amount of data, let's say the images, especially panoramic images taken from within the inside of the buildings, it will be difficult for us to assess how much this to assess the street level greenery from another angle, because right now only available data is from the street. Then it is that kind of, unless we have more availability of the data.
But I think actually, you bring up an important question here, because I think what's happening though is that we're assessing the urban experience, or we're assessing the urban design experience from these various sort of proxies of imagery and whatnot. In Ermark's paper with Christoph Reinhardt and Daniel Fink and myself, what we do there is sort of we shoot rays out of every single window. But the interesting thing is actually in that study is how much do you actually get of the street? So what is the street experience from those views, right? Because you go all the way up the geometry of the structure. In this place, actually, what is kind of missing is that we have a street level experience, but it's actually from the center of the street. Because of the nature of how it's collected, right? It's this car that goes down the middle of the road and then it like looks out, and this is sort of the experience. So I think it's actually a good identification point to make, is that I understand about what the experience is from the center of the street of the level of green density. So I think that's an important clarification point. And then I think actually the discontinuity stuff that we've started over the summer to try to address that, especially with the bids, but also with the tenant research. So we've run we've run the CompStack rent stuff. The rents also perform in the similar way, with high financial performance. So we could also look at what those tenants are underneath and whether or not they're sorting into these specific types of greener density places. But we've got a bundling problem. So hedonic models really suffer from these bundling problems. They help us to price, they help us to point to strategies and interventions that we need to make, but they hinder us in the ability to really understand whether or not those correlates are quite endogenous. The lasso maybe helps us a little bit. So a discontinuity strategy is what we were also pursuing with this bid. So I think that's a really great point, and we're gonna add that as an appendix into the paper before we submit. So we really appreciate that feedback.
Tony, another question. When you were calculating the value add for the green space, were you able to differentiate how much of it was on-site done by the developer and how much was off-site done by the municipality? I mean, New York's kind of an odd example because it's so dense, but in other words, if your numbers, I mean, the study's fascinating, and that would encourage developers to build more green space, which is what we want. But could you tell the difference between which was sort of self-inflicted and which was just there when they started?
Unfortunately, no.
No.
We
can just see the bids. We can see that the bids do stuff, but they don't do a lot with green. So that's the interesting thing. You can tell from the numbers that the bids do a lot with other things that they're up to, whereas they don't spend as much money on greenery and trees in that environment.
Right. Because I mean, it'll work both ways. I mean, the higher values will give higher taxes, which will encourage cities to build more green space. But we also want to use it as a lever to get developers to do more of their own green space, especially with, maybe not where it's as dense as New York, but in a lot of cities, you actually have some space you can do more green space. And this study would allow us to use that as leverage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, I would just love to get the planners, if I look at like our own community, like I'm looking at Jamaica Plain, or I'm looking at, so parks are one thing, but actually investing in the greenery on the street so we can, you know,
Right.
decrease the urban heat island, et cetera, would be an incredible investment for our communities, especially if we can tease out more of this indigeneity that we see with some of the sidewalks and other issues here. So.
Yeah.
And you can leverage this study, I think, quite well. Well done.
Tony, that was a fantastic presentation. Some really fantastic, or some really great comments in there, and it's such an interesting topic. Dennis, we have time for one quick question. Quick.
Okay, it's a comment question. It strikes me that the value differences have a lot to do with the context, and I thought it was very interesting that you looked at this at different distances away. But in a city where every street has trees, the value increase of putting your office on a street with trees is not there. In a place like New York, which has very few streets with street trees, when you come across one that has a lot of street trees, you say, wow, this is a better street.
Yeah, exactly.
So really, one of the lessons is the relationship to the context. And how much does this particular property stand out from a normal, let's say, property in the city? The more it's differentiated, the higher value as well would be my hypothesis. And trees are a method of differentiation.
Cool.
Thanks, Dennis.
But great study, really interesting, and a lot of different directions to go here. You know, Chris's question is really interesting because for a long time, urban designers were trying to remove huge areas of greenery surrounding urban buildings to remove the kind of suburban idea that buildings should be floating in parks. So it really illuminates this argument about green or not green, or how much green, or what kind of green.
Tony, I think you can see from those comments how interesting a topic you've hit on here, and you know where you can go from this, and really, really well done. With that, we will convene for a 10-minute break, and before our final presentation this morning. So I will see you all back here at 11:35.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. Our final presentation this morning is from Dr. Andrea Chagoo, and it is on the financial value of healthy buildings. So with that, I will give it over to you, Andrea. You're on mute.
Thank you. So this presentation is actually has a great deal of gratitude for the co-author, which is Natasha Sadikin. We had somebody fell ill this week, so we actually ran out. One of the speakers couldn't join us. And so Natasha stepped up to the plate to try to produce some initial healthy building results. So these are fresh off the press. So as much feedback as possible is incredibly welcome, because we don't have much research on this field outside of the brilliant work that Juan is doing in the Sustainable Urbanization Lab. There isn't just a ton of researchers running around looking at the financial performance indicators of these types of groundbreaking and new types of spaces. So I'd love a lot of feedback today, and I'm super grateful to Natasha for giving us lots of insights in such a short amount of time. So what we're going to do today is look at what are healthy buildings, what are the technological and design interventions that are going in to make these corporate or institutional level healthy buildings. This is what we're mainly talking about, and bridging off of some of that work that Juan was talking about earlier. So what are people doing to make these buildings healthier, and then what are the overall improvements that we could see from potentially from employee or from tenant well-being. And that's why we're starting to see, well, is there some sort of financial impact? And there's a long literature that looks at whether or not there's an impact, say, from sustainability or from smart buildings, or from some sort of treatment from a design, engineering, and technological perspective to improve the performance of commercial buildings. Now, this is very early work. So again, all of the questions that you have, jot them down and shoot them at me. I am not scared. This paper needs lots of feedback because of the early days, and this is just the first type of paper to head in the value direction. So we need lots of work here. So big picture, we're all doing this conference from home. We'd rather be doing it all together, but unfortunately we're in the virtual, and that has to do with, of course, this COVID-19 pandemic and how it has had a massive disruption on our life. Some communities around the globe have been able to manage the COVID-19 crisis and get people back into buildings. In some instances, because they're able to manage the technological and automated processes a little bit better than the United States has been able. That's just kind of true. So I think one of the things that we need to be mindful of is that a large proportion of global offices cannot return to work. And businesses that I talk to at every single level, from some of the largest global real estate investors to some of the more local Class B owners and developers, are really trying to figure out how we get back to this daily normalcy, and what is it that the building needs to do to respond to this crisis. We talk a lot now about the aerosolization of the COVID-19 disease particles that have come up from epidemiologists and even like healthy building purveyors like Joe Allen over at Harvard. And so we know that this is actually in the air, but there's a lot of building owners that aren't paying attention to like their air quality, their HEPA filters, et cetera, et cetera. So what can we start to do to understand systematically about what we need to do about these buildings? The other thing is that this is coming from a long legacy of sort of literature around green buildings, or almost 100-year process in improving the quality of the built environment. So sustainability is not new. That's, the type of transformations in buildings are at least 30 years old. What can we at least, say older in other parts of the world? And so what are we doing to sort of build off of that green building space, and how is that being transformed into what we're now going to start calling healthy buildings as like a certified standard for what we're going to do. And then, we also really need to think about this more structurally. So, we're getting much more into our tenant experience or employee experience. We're paying much more, attention to how we live, work, and play as a society. We have more wealth, so we're able to do this. And now we know that how much time is like a white collar workers or increasingly blue collar workers who actually work in factories, what is their experience with time indoors? And so how do we sort of transform this indoor built environment experience? And this is an opportunity to enhance our health and well-being, to minimize its impact on the healthcare system. So how are we going to do this? So coming back to that sick building idea that that Juan mentioned earlier, and the amazing study that he did to sort of with Pete and Nils, just really to understand how that's sort of transforming and changing the genuine experience and the genuine quality of people walking through, and how that's changing how they do what they do. And then there's an increasing emphasis on this happy employee. So how are we going to make our employees happy so they stay with us? This is not, a critical moment right now, because we have, the greatest unemployment in the history of any economy that we've measured. I'm not going back to the Middle Ages, but in modern times, we've never seen this level of unemployment. So people are a little bit more attuned to taking whatever they may be offered, which is not great. So it might be an opportunity for poor behavior on behalf of those who are in charge. We hope that's not the case, and we hope that they were really maintaining those high levels of the 2019 sort of approach, where they're really thinking about employee happiness and thinking about their health and well-being, so they can bring them back into the building. So we really want to take that sort of holistic approach and think about it from that perspective, and then really try to align the financial and economic incentives of this very large institutional real estate community, whether it be owners or investors, and really start to understand how healthy buildings can help achieve these asset level parities, perhaps with the current market, but perhaps, if possible, outstanding performance in some key US markets. So first, big picture, healthy buildings is getting slung around a lot right now. So let's talk about what it is. So a healthy building is a space that supports the physical, psychological, and social health and well-being of people. According to the World Health Organization, a healthy building can be seen as the next generation of green buildings that not only includes environmentally responsible and resource efficient building concepts, but also integrates this health, wellness, and human experience into buildings. I emphasize this in the lab. What I've learned, I'm trained as a financial economist, but what I learned when I arrived at MIT is that so many of the products that we try to put into the institutional investor portfolio and the strategies that we employ, they come from architects, and they come from engineers, and they come from people who work on implementing new technologies. It just doesn't just show up in the portfolio and we're like, that's great. Somebody has to create and invent these types of things. And so healthy buildings is now a bundle of technology. So James and Natasha put together this diagram of a building and all the type of technologies that are starting to come together or bundle together to create a healthy building, and what types of design strategies are being implemented. I'd say the big thing that everybody's talking right now is air quality, how to improve air quality through mechanical ventilation, through taking on board different types of filtration systems, having an indoor air quality policy, thinking about where natural ventilation can play a part, green roofs or gardens, or actually living green walls inside the building. So coming back to basing off of what we talked about with Tony, how can we actually bring in this greenness into the actual physical structure to improve the physical experience and the well-being, and also the equity of the buildings. So the way that this starts to get institutionalized, and I think this is an important thing to understand about how this gets developed. These types of technologies, they don't need a certification to come together. And also designers have been doing this for quite some time, right? So this isn't something new. These types of things are being bundled together, and they're being suggested by these certification systems, or schemes, just like with sustainability, or with increasingly with Wired Score's new smart building standard. The idea is that we're actually bundling these technologies together, and then we're actually setting these standards so that the outside world can actually say, oh, well, that building's healthy and that building's not. And that's why these things get started. It's not so much that that they intend to health wash or green wash or smart wash the system, but what they're intending to do is to try to remove this lemons problem. Whether that works or not, I think, is an excellent debate, and I'm happy to have it. But I think what we do learn from an institutional perspective is that no investor is going to put up pony up the money for a certification unless they understand what it is, what is the menu that they're actually buying, and then having some sort of a sense that they can underwrite that and get some value ROI back on the performance. That is how the institutional markets play, and even then they don't necessarily trust the numbers. It's incredibly frustrating for those of us who do the work, but you know, it is the way, one of the paths forward in sort of developing change. So there's two standards right now. There's Fitwell and Well standard that have been developed over the last decade. They've been actually, you know, pushing lots of projects. When we first went to do this research about 5 years ago, you know, there wasn't enough Well and Fitwell projects to be able to even do a valuation study. So we did a project on smart, connected, and green, and we wanted to make it healthy, smart, connected, and green. It just wasn't ready yet. So now actually we went back and we looked at the data this summer, and we were actually able to see some things that are going on. And it doesn't look too different from a traditional sustainability study or traditional sustainability certification. It's got some sort of certification level. They have different project types that they certify for. There's a registration cost that varies between the two different groups. It's third-party certified, so it comes out and it says it gives you a seal of approval, and then you have to go through this process of recertification. How you verify can be in various ways. So they look through the documentation of your design schematics with an architect and an engineer, or it can go through some actual post-occupancy performance testing, which is the thing that Well is sort of emphasizing as their differentiator at the moment. And when we look at how many projects we have so far, you know, between the two, we have about, between Well and Fitwell, we have about 755 projects that have been registered across 65 countries. In terms of certified projects between the two, you know, there's not more than, say, 300 projects, but that does translate not necessarily into more transactions that we could observe from a pricing standpoint, but it could point to more in terms of rent. So we could see these buildings renting, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So what we want to look at is, you know, what is the financial impact of a healthy building? And we really do this to align incentives and get the industry moving to see whether or not, you know, there's a value proposition for engaging in this type of design and development strategy, and if so, what should be sort of engaged. And this was broadly very popular with sustainability. There was some upsides and downsides to that, and I'm very happy to explore and discuss how we can try to minimize that with healthy buildings and whether we should. As part of it is out of our hands as scientists, but I think what we're trying to understand is what is the impact, and then what that potentially represents. So right now, as a working copy of this, we're interpreting, you know, so no value differential. So if the rents are equivalent to that of projects that are not in a healthy building sort of certified state, and we know that they've actually are recently developed or new, you know, are they equal in terms of how they're, you know, a stakeholder sort of perceives them in the marketplace? Whether just new is new, and that's great, no worries. The second is that there's an idea that there could be a negative financial performance, and that actually there's a potential delivery failure. So healthy buildings are not delivering what they promised in terms of health, and or actually the marketplace is not willing to actually incorporate healthy building features into their willingness to pay for spaces, or there's a positive result. So healthy employees bring upside, bring more tenant retention, potentially more tenant willingness to pay on behalf of the tenants. And so this is a good thing that they want to engage in. So we're going to take this framework and see what the financial results are. In terms of our identification strategy, what we did is we took these well-registered projects and Fitwell registered projects, and then we saw whether or not they actually, and then we combined the two and made them equal in terms of them being a healthy building. That we don't have enough power with one or the other at this time, so we don't feel comfortable reporting results of whether or not a Well or a Fitwell project is the ultimate winner, and I don't think that that's a wise thing. So what we want to do is just evaluate healthiness overall. Their metrics are overall quite similar. It's just their post-occupancy that's a little bit different. From here, what we did was then we identified 10 healthy building cities. So we looked at the 10 top commercial markets in the United States. So Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. And for each one of these, we took the healthy building rental contracts that we could observe using the CompStack database. And then we observe these rental contracts, not at the building level. I just want to make sure that that's clear. We look at all of the contracts in a building that was either certified overall as certified or registered as healthy versus, and also in some instances, there are just certain floors that are registered or certified as healthy. So that can also happen, but we took those differentials and we put those in a pool. And then we employed the doing well by doing good strategy developed by Pete Eichholz and Nils Kalk and John Quigley, where we looked at the address and then we drew a radius of 1/4 mile around that. And then we did a matched peer sample of the buildings and the rental contracts around the healthy building to match that specific locational variation. So we want to get as like for like as possible. So we get like for like on the location, we get like for like on the time of the rental contract, we get like for like on the quality. And then we really tried to sort of remove any of those differentiators. So we're having a true treatment and control group. And we're trying to say, okay, this is the one differentiator that we're getting at, these healthy building or healthy rental contracts versus not. When we look at the brief sample statistics, what we see overall is that, from a healthy buildings perspective, we're already seeing a delta on the average transaction or average rental price per square foot. So that's about a $56.40 annual rental contract rate for a healthy building versus a $53.30. It's not a huge delta, but it is something that we can examine to see whether or not that's statistically significantly different. The standard deviation is slightly higher here, and then the mins and the maxes are somewhat comparable. There's a little bit of skewness in there that we have to correct for in the models. In terms of transaction square footage, they're following the pathways of sustainable and smart buildings. We see just larger floor plates being invested in, so 24,725 square feet on average, with a really significant standard deviation, almost twice that of the mean. And then moving over to the transaction square footage of a control building, it's almost half of that. So that's something that we see resonating over and over again when we're looking at how these buildings transform to adopt these new technologies or design strategies. They just get bigger, even with the average building getting slightly bigger. So that's something important to keep in mind. There's a lot of Class A real estate here, but actually in terms of the match, actually we kept it pretty comparable. So we have a 60% sample for the control and a 90% sample for the Class A. We could probably improve a little bit more on that. And then in terms of the lease term, we have about the lease term in terms of months. These lease terms are longer for healthy buildings. Again, something that we see over and over again in sort of these innovative products. They take up longer lease terms, and they have just slightly longer free rent periods. So we're starting to see some patterns. And I think that's one of the big things that we're looking for in the lab is understanding, how do these pricing parameters change given when we push out to the frontier of what we're looking for, and how is the market sort of starting to underwrite this? And this is something that I think is very intelligible and something for us to pay attention to, because we want to think about, okay, what types of products are we making? What are the technology and design bundles? But ultimately, what are also the underwriting standards that we're using to get this done? And I think that's critical for getting some of these things adopted. This is a look at the, go ahead.
2 minutes.
Okay, this is a look at the variation across the cities and where we're actually picking up the treatment and control buildings and the types of bundles that we're seeing. Again, in New York and LA, there's really no surprise of where we're actually seeing some stuff. In Boston as well. So I think this is just the institutional environment moving towards the adoption of these types of products. In total, we have 2,324 rental contracts, and ultimately compared with 13,533 non-healthy rental contracts nearby across these 10 major markets. We're running a regression model, and we're looking for that factor loading on the healthy dummy. So we're looking at that healthy certified space, and we're looking at that factor loading and seeing whether or not there's a financial delta, so we can see whether or not what the interpretation is. So when we run the regression at this point, this is the fullest extent of the modeling technique that has come out of all of the papers that we've done in the lab. So we're utilizing every single feature that we've found to be significant, utilizing that lasso technique. So everything is in there. So there's lots of controls that I'm actually not showing you. There's a substantial amount of control variables in there, and those are all deemed significant according to the lasso. So we have to keep all of them, and they also help to improve the fit of the variation explaining prices. So we get somewhere between 65 and 70%. And ultimately what we see is that when we do the fullest extent of the model, where we're controlling for these leasing and building and tenant characteristics, overall, and tenant variation. So we really try to get at that tenant heterogeneity and tenant quality difference. I really care about that. We're working on another paper on that. We see that healthy contracts actually are starting to, that they're showing a price loading. So about a 4% per square foot. And I think that is right now is statistically and economically significant. And I think we need to just sort of pay attention to that. So that's a first signal. We'll run a whole bunch of robustness checks over the next 3 months to see what we can do, and then we'll also see if we can run some transaction pricing. But I think it's interesting that what we see is that, you know, healthy buildings at this point have as many as contracts as sustainable buildings right now, actually a little bit more, almost 2x more at this point in time. So healthy buildings might be getting a faster adoption rate than sustainable buildings. We want to watch that, but that's very interesting. The second thing is that we really need to pay attention to at least the technologies that are going into these buildings, because this COVID-19 pandemic is really impacting all of us, and it's our health and our well-being and our social structures and our ability to create. We need spaces. I mean, some of us don't want to ever go back to the office, but some of us don't want to go back sometimes, and we need a healthy place to go there. And then finally, you know, these results are somewhat comparable to what we've seen in the sustainability literature and using the same techniques. So it's promising to me that we're headed in the same direction, but we have a little bit more robustness to do. So happy to take more feedback here. And then next, we're going to work on transaction data sort of results. So looking forward to any feedback here. New work, really fresh off the press. Again, thanks to Natasha for hustling hard to get us some results super quick. To fill in the spot. But yeah, so first look at the incremental financial performance of these healthy buildings from a rental standpoint. Looks like it's positive. Looks like it's heading in the right direction, but I think there's much more work to be done to make sure that it's incredibly robust and not endogenous with a lot of these sustainability factors, et cetera, et cetera. Open to questions and feedback and any dings so that we can make this awesome and get that out there.
I see Dennis.
I have a question, which basically revolves around the standards, the wellness standards and the Fitwell standards. Whether are they based on actual health outcomes? In other words, what are we valuing here? Are we valuing data on health outcomes from these buildings, or the designation that they are a, quote, well building? I mean, what are the health outcomes that we're witnessing in these projects? This is the big stumble that happened with LEED. You know, you could have a highly ranked LEED building that was really not very sustainable. So I'm wondering whether the wellness standards are coming from health outcome, measurements of health outcome, or just anecdotal information, and
it's 12 o'clock,
and what we're actually valuing with the data. Does that make sense, Andrea?
Yeah, totally. I'll address this, and then actually I'll kick it over to Steve to start to lead the discussion for us, because I think that that's relevant. It's 12 o'clock, okay. So we want to stay a little bit on time. But so I actually think I would point to Juan's research that we heard about this morning. So what we learned from his studies is that actually we don't know very much about the performance of health, especially when it comes to workers. I mean, that statistic really struck me. And I think it really points to actually how these certification schemes either advance or fall down. And so I know that Juan did a pitch out to the well-being standard last week on behalf of the center to really try to work on that. And I hope that there's a lot of success there, because I think unlike the sustainability research, we didn't have these correlative patterns even at an individual building level that said, the financial performance is great, but the real driver is that actually I'm changing your energy bill, or I'm really changing your water and your waste consumption. And that really drove an entire industry of sustainability. This industry around health is really just getting started. So it's about 5 to 7 years old. And then this correlative sort of performance with how humans are doing based off of these healthy building interventions is not as strong. And I think it needs lots of development across cohorts. And I hope that Juan will chime in during the discussion. I think that's a great discussion sort of kickoff, because I think that is really problematic. It's pointing towards value, which might be, again, this class A, solid, sexy building with green walls and great filtration systems. You feel good in the building, but you just don't know if that's just coming from all of these different correlates coming together. So we're seeing the same patterns. I like seeing that. Is there endogeneity there between smart and connected and green and all of these things? Yes. Should we not invest in them? No, because there is some sort of valuation delta there. It's around this bundle. So I don't want to tell my developers or investors not to do that. But I do want to say, wait, let do more. And I think, find out from Juan how to monitor the health and well-being of your employees. Talk to Humanize, talk to the Media Lab to find out how to do all of this so that we can actually get back into our buildings. Don't just abandon it because you don't know how to do it. Let's do it so I can get back into the building and feel good. And you can make doing well, feeling good by doing well. Yeah, feeling good by doing well. Yeah.
Anyway.
So that cues us up for a good question for Juan, or maybe James, or anybody else. Is there an emerging tech stack? The same way we can point to a tech stack that exists in smart and green buildings. We can look at all of the either startups or legacy companies that have put in the sensors and all the gadgetry. Are we starting to see that, Juan? Either some of those existing systems starting to measure certain health aspects, or are there new gadgets that are starting to show up in buildings?
Yeah, so there is, those are great questions. So Steve, what I see is that what is becoming more and more available is sensors and sensor networks that are measuring environmental conditions in buildings. It used to be, when I started my PhD in 2015, it took us a lot of work to find a sensor provider that will be able to deploy sensors in 300 classrooms. We had to go to San Francisco, we had to go to a lot of places to just get someone to put sensors in the Netherlands. It's something that we thought that was very obvious, very easy. But now, from that point onwards, there was a lot of new companies and new technology making. The sensors were there for a long time. What they have been very good at doing is now integrating them into clouds and so forth, so then you make it available very easily to the operation managers of a building. So now it's very easy for these people to just check their phone and see which spaces are not operating well. And that's also something kind of that connects to Andrea's discussion and Dennis' points. I think that also one of the things that are happening in the certification side is that while a lot of the certifications for sustainability and green were very focused on the design, some of them are starting to look at the operations too. So to have this technology to check, not only once you build it, what was the performance when you build it, but really how it performs while it is operating in terms of air quality and some other things. So that's something that it is happening, that you don't forget, you don't stop looking at the building once you finish building it, but you keep testing it along the way when your workforce is in place.
Right. So, and a couple of comments on that. One is that LEED never had a program in place to check your certification or recertify every year. That took a while to get that in place. And then also another comment that just anecdotally from one of our center partners, one of our good friends at Cisco, apparently Cisco's systems have had sensors, presence sensors and monitors in their systems for years and years. But nobody ever put them to use for anything. So I'm wondering, there may be a lot of legacy technology in buildings that just hasn't been called upon yet, and now may be the time. So anyway, just a couple of anecdotes. James, anything on we know Human Eyes, we know the sensor companies, we know the tenant engagement companies. Anything new and interesting in startup land?
Well, there are a number, but I would just like to add to Juan's comments as well. And this was a very common theme that we discovered throughout the World Real Estate Forum last month. And it was the types of sensors that come into the buildings that are so important. And really, with the best example of this has been in Asia. So, they've had a number of different pandemics over the last, 10 to 15 years. So they have far more experience on the ground than US companies. And what they've seen is that with all of this technology coming in, it has to be part of the framework, and it has to be hardwired into the building. Otherwise, there's no real value from it. Because if it's a mobile situation, or if it's something that you can just, you're utilizing, within your lobby for a short space of time because of, you're trying to, create a safer environment due to, let's say, COVID. What happens is over, in 6 months' time, it finds itself in a room out the back gathering dust. So to get the real value out of any of these technologies, there has to be kind of more of a bigger expenditure in inputting it into the building and in encapsulating it within the entire we'll call it mainframe of the structure. And I think that's an important part of trying to understand all of these different technologies that are coming along and making sure from this. I'd also say that because this, and I've said this at a number of different talks recently, in that a lot of the technology that's coming out, people are always trying to evaluate which ones to go, and because there's new ones every week. And what we've seen here today is that if it is something that can really help with encapsulating healthy buildings or green buildings and sustainability, then you are going to get value out of it over the course of the next few years. A lot of people are looking at things on a short-term solution at the minute with COVID, but if you can see that this is going to help create or better understand a healthy building, then it is a technology that you want to try and bring in.
Thanks, James.
If I could just follow up for a second. I mean, there are products that are coming out to facilitate the hard wiring of buildings for health sensing. The big one is Edge Technologies, which patented and is now producing sealing systems that have a huge array of potential sensors that can monitor people down to the individual level. In other words, if there's a meeting going on in the room, it knows who's there and what their oxygen levels are and levels in the room, and can really get down to some fine-grained sensing, which they've employed in their own projects, of course, but now they're manufacturing these for other. And so you'll see more and more and more building products coming out, just as we've seen in the past with other kind of revolutions in real estate. The market responds with new products, and then they get incorporated into buildings, and you have the capability.
Yeah, no doubt Schneider Electric and Philips all have sensor-enabled lighting fixtures, and there'll be power over Ethernet, so the power is going to change, and that will all be censored if it isn't already. So related to this, I had a question on Adriano's work. Regarding because that was about understanding all of the various transportation modes and the impact on commercial development and how that gets integrated into this kind of mesh of how humans move around through the built environment. Adriano, while we're on this technology theme, what do you wish existed out there to help us better understand that? Because my takeaway from your fantastic presentation and the research is that it's still very hard to get at what's going on, because it's very hard to get the right data at the right time in the right place. And I realize it's getting better because we've got a lot of mobility data from our devices, but what do you wish was out there that isn't?
Yeah, so I think that recently several historical analysis on the history of about cities in general, about in the urban studies field, we have seen very interesting papers being published with historical data that people are being able to recover this information, historical information, and somehow process that, to geocode that, to by any way measure that historically. So we saw recently interesting papers on New York doing some related producing related results to my research. There is also a very interesting paper on London, based on London, how the development of subway in London has also separated the housing places and the working places. So I think that there's one interesting thing is that people are being able to get historical data from cities and their development during the last century and process that to use in the kind of big data analysis. But in terms of for more recent and more more recent analysis, as we are doing the subway network and urban vibrancy project, I think that we have a lot of data. I don't feel that we have missed data, but the challenge for my perspective, from my practice as a researcher today, is the difficulty of making them comparable. So I think that on Annie's presentation with Dong Xiao, she briefly mentioned that and how difficult it is to compare Chinese and North American data, because they use different protocols and different classifications, and they really measure in different ways. So for more recent analysis, I think that the difficulty is to produce cross-context analysis and make the data comparable. I would say that this is the challenge today. But I think that we have a lot of data for urban studies today. That's fantastic.
Sure. Other questions on that topic? Thank you, Adriano. Is Annie with us online? I had a related question. Yeah. Are you there, Annie?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi there. How are you? Great presentation.
All right.
Actually, great presentation for all. By the way, for everybody today. I'm so proud of what the lab teams are doing on these topics, and I know the center had been pursuing these topics earlier, but it is so much more urgent now with the COVID-19 experience and the heightened concern about equity. So anyway, thank you, everybody. Annie, I have a related question on, again, on data. I have to keep coming back to data, but that seems like a very common theme and will be in the future. What proxies are there for vibrancy? I was just thinking as a kind of I'm not a researcher, so it's a naive question maybe, but how do you measure vibrancy? The same question Dennis had is sort of, how do you measure health? You can look at outcomes, but what is vibrancy from a measurement standpoint?
I think some of the measures that are sort of idiosyncratic would be population age, sort of venues for entertainment venues.
Yeah. Number of coffee shops per square meter.
Well, you can't go in those anymore. So
yeah, right.
Queues outside of restaurants. No. Mm-hmm. Measures along like that. The issue is when you're looking at metro areas is, in a sense, it's a macro level, because you can have part of a metro area being very vibrant and part of it not being vibrant at all. So thinking about how best to do that, I'd be interested in knowing if they've had experience doing that, how they have done it in the past.
Because arguably one person's vibrancy is another person's congestion.
Right, exactly.
I remember a developer walking into a presentation and his first slide was "Sprawl is good." And I mean, there's a little bit of truth to that, right? You know, that is a potential measure for economic vitality. So anyway, Dennis?
I was going to say, I think one of the measures is the level of diversity in the public realm. So if we have a public realm that is all single-family homes, that's probably measures less vibrant than, you know, Boylston Street or something in Boston, because the diversity is so much higher. That's one thing I would look to.
But again, if you're looking at a metro area, how, you know, they encompass, you know, you think about Boston, it goes out to New Hampshire, goes up into New Hampshire. And so taking a measurement
doesn't seem very meaningful, yeah.
I forget the name of the startup. Early on, before it was even called PropTech, there was a UK-based company that was monitoring social media, and they were heat mapping activity at unexpected and unusual times of the day to identify areas around London that had some action going on where nobody thought there was action going on. So it was, and I don't know if these were raves, if these were illegal parties, what they were, if they were pop-up this, pop-up that. But that was the premise, was that they felt that if there was all this Twitter traffic, or, well, at the time, it was probably maybe, I don't know what I guess Facebook was early, but they were using it as the proxy for there must be activity in these neighborhoods because we don't have any housing there, we don't have any notable retail, but there's something going on there.
Drug sales.
Drug sales.
Maybe.
So much on urban vibrancy, I think.
So my thought, when we started this to measure the urban vibrancy, so we are thinking like at least two types. One is the production side, production vibrancy. That's kind of production agglomeration.
Yeah.
The other is consumption side, consumption vibrancy. And currently we are talking all those papers. For today, I think it's about the, especially Adriano's work is about the consumption vibrancy. And for that, I totally agree with Dennis. So basically, the dimensions we are thinking about is first density and diversity, and then the interactions. So how people interact with each other for the consumption side, and for the production side will be these firms interact with each other. So that will generate this positive externality, and at the same time negative, as Steve said, like congestion and even pollution, like that. So that's kind of a vibrancy, our understanding.
And maybe we should be including green trees.
That will help the urban vibrancy as
well. Sure. So is Tony still with us? I had a question for Tony.
Yeah.
Are you still there, Tony?
Tony?
Maybe he's helping the cat. I can help answer.
Okay, so I had a question about, and maybe I missed it, but I had a question about on when we measure the greenness in the trees. It was brought up about measuring the quality of the green trees. I was also wondering, could we do time lapse on that, because trees mature in a young neighborhood, they're small and kind of lame, and then as they grow up, as they get mature, the neighborhood gets richer, to Dennis's point, and then as they age and they start falling apart and getting cut down, and then there aren't many left. So I'm also wondering if we have to consider a kind of a time lapse evaluation model on that as well.
Yeah, other literature has actually looked at the correlative patterns between actually the measure of greenness and like the quality of trees and quality of the greenery over time. So this also includes like bushes and grass and also trees, and like so different variations of trees. Treepedia does a lot of work in sort of identifying, what is the ideal tree. What is the ultimate tree that sort of gives the most cover and whatnot. And then also in the Sustainable Buildings Lab over in architecture, they do a lot on tree cover. So understanding, what are the right trees to actually get the right shadowing, and actually how that has ultimately a big impact on the urban design and ultimately on the value of the district. They've done that at the district level. Right. So what we see is actually something that is and I think the big point of this research that we found is, yeah, it's so exciting to use machine learning and deep learning, et cetera. And that's great. But I think the big picture takeaway that I was like, wow, trees are incredibly important. And now when I walk a city and I walk a real estate, I look at it and I go, you don't have enough trees and you don't have enough budget on trees. And that is actually creating some sort of inequality between the neighborhoods and across the city. And so I've become this weird advocate over the past 3 months of trees and growing trees and creating a tree canopy for cities, because that's the way forward. And particularly when it comes, I'm watching the riots in Wisconsin, and you'll look out, there's no trees. And you go, there's no trees. I mean, these people are really suffering because there's no trees. And so we really, not to beat a drum, we need to invest in trees on behalf of cities, but also real estate developers. You know, they really need to have an actual landscape architect who comes in and does an incredible job and pays attention to what the experience is of people, your shadows, well, where you can go.
Andrea, we need to give them the evidence so that they can justify, because I would imagine the tree budget, Dennis, you're a recovering architect. Isn't the tree budget the first thing to get cut?
Often, but the point here is that developers need to be taking responsibility for the public environment. The public sector has not been able to maintain the density of tree planting and so forth that everyone would like. And the private sector, if you're going to put your $2 billion project on, Boylston Street, then what Andrea is saying is the value of that project may be, in fact, significantly determined by the trees along the street. So why wouldn't you take this relatively small expense of putting trees in the public realm on the street, even though you may think it's the city's responsibility? I think that's where it hits development.
And if we can give developers the evidence that it adds value, then
they're gonna do better in the long run if they improve the environment for everyone. That's a real finding, I think.
There's endogeneity issues that I think we need to tease out a little bit and just seeing where it's really coming from. And I really like the feedback from today, but I think that overall, really paying attention to these technology and design interventions and the pairing of them together, I think that combined, like what Adriana's doing, what Annie's doing, what Juan is doing, and what we're doing here in the lab, we're really trying to we're trying to figure out what this puzzle is. What is this puzzle for better stuff, better buildings, better communities? Nobody's trying to hurt anybody here. We're not sort of proposing graffiti. Although graffiti does do amazing things, but still what we're proposing is well-being, is sustainability.
Trying to measure well-being, or what are the factors that produce well-being in cities, but that gets back to how you measure well-being.
So and also if it comes back to, if you really needed to hit your bottom line, and I get that. So if it really needs to hit back your bottom line, especially because it pays our pensions, like I get it, right? Then I'm happy to deliver this evidence to you. It's part of our doing well by doing good experience here at MIT. I just hope that they listen, and then I'm showing you in underwriting. I'm showing you, so Juan's showing you what it means to actually really pay attention to the health and well-being of these people, and what types of changes in productivity you're getting. Adriana's really thinking about the strategy behind what types of transportation dynamics we can create to create vibrancy, and what's the strategy of employing those. So, if the combination of these types of thinking, along with what we're understanding around COVID, is an outcome here, then I really hope that the investors are paying attention and really trying to make some changes that will improve their bottom line, but also our world. Like, I want to go back to work. I miss talking to people in person.
On that note, I think that was a terrific.
Not in person.
I think that was a terrific wrap up, Andrea. Do you Are we, I want to be sensitive to the time. That was pretty great.
Let's be sensitive to the time. And then, you know, on my preach box, I'm going to say, join us for the fall seminar series. We're going to talk more about health and sustainability and urban design and technology and innovation, you know, building off of the vision that Dennis had for city making. Sichi has taken over the center, and she's just really passionate and caring about these topics. These are her visions. And she really wants to help us with developing our research further. So we're going to have more of these fall seminar series. She's supporting us through us. So we're really excited. And so join us throughout the fall. We're going to do these once a month. We had, you know, lots of registrants, and we had, you know, somewhere between 75 to 100 people throughout the summer.
Yeah.
People don't go during the summer. So it was great. What fantastic presentations today. James, thank you for moderating. You kept everyone on time and well behaved. It was amazing. And Steve, thank you for coming in and giving us a great discussion that was relevant to science and to the industry. And thanks to all of our participants for the great questions. That was just magical. Actually, it was a great end to the summer. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Juan.
I might add a huge thank you to you, Andrea. Like, I mean, for all of us at the lab. Like, I mean, for you are the engine room that makes it tick, and putting all of this together, it wouldn't happen without you. So a huge thank you to you.
Well, thank you. And then thank you to the people at the center for helping us to get this going. Stevie and Dennis, thank you for supporting us this summer. This was really great. I think it gave a lot of emphasis to our research. Thank you to our researchers, Tony, and thanks to Natasha for that all-nighter to get that deck up and running. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Recording will be available later. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.